enterprising sideshow operator by the name of Bunny Clark bought it for $760, a huge amount of money at the time for an old used car. Bunny traveled to county fairs with the car, which was kept inside a tent. A big sign outside the tent read, "See the car that hauled the dead from their graves. Ed Gein's crime car. $1,000 reward if it's not true." The car attracted big crowds, and during its first appearance at a two-day county fair, 2,000 people paid the 25-cent admission price. The public uproar across Wisconsin over the morbid exploitation eventually convinced county fairs to ban the attraction permanently. Whatever became of the car after that is a mystery. Chapter 20. Wayne Williams. Notable fact: a woman, searching for deposit bottles along the road in a slum section of Atlanta, saw a leg sticking out of some undergrowth. In the 20th century, few stories equal what came to be known as the Atlanta child murders. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, in the city of Atlanta, one African-American child after another was found murdered. Panic spread as mothers and fathers and grandparents wondered whether their loved one would be next. Nothing seemed to stop the killer. The first two bodies showed up dumped on the side of the road, found by a woman searching for deposit bottles along the road in a slum section of Atlanta, who saw a leg sticking out of some undergrowth. It was the leg of 14-year-old Edward Smith. She then discovered a second body, that of Alfred Evans, about 50 feet from the first. Investigators later determined that Smith had been shot in the head with a .22. Evans' body was in such a state of advanced decay that the cause of death was uncertain, possibly strangulation. More bodies started to show up in fairly quick succession. The next body found was that of 14-year-old Milton Harvey, who had gone to the bank on September 4th, 1979, a week earlier, and had never come back. On October 21st, the body of Yusuf Bell, who had gone on an errand for his mother and disappeared, was found, his body decomposing in the crawl space of an elementary school. Weirdly, his clothes were clean, and it was clear that, though he had been missing for 10 days, he had only been dead for half that time. In early March 1980, the body of a 12-year-old girl was found, and just one day after that, 10-year-old Jeffrey Mathis disappeared. On May 18th, yet another boy, Eric Middlebrooks, disappeared after receiving a phone call at 10:30 at night. At first, Atlanta police were in denial about the fact that they were dealing with a serial killer. The disappearances continued one after the other, mostly boys, but a few girls also, which clouded the situation. Were they dealing with the same killer, or did someone else murder the girls? Generally, serial killers have a very specific victim type and rarely deviate from it. However, since the killings had started, there had been 7 bodies of young people recovered, and 3 more were missing. A serial killer was on the loose. Then, in July, the summer of death began. The bodies of 5 young boys were discovered. Not only was a serial killer on the loose, but an extraordinarily dangerous serial killer. He was a prolific murderer who preyed on naive young children. Special agents from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, Roy Hazelwood and John Douglas, had come down to Atlanta to help local police. After they absorbed what was going on, they tried to give Atlanta police insight into the killer. They created a profile. They told the locals that the killer was likely African American, about 29 years old, homosexual, and possibly a movie producer. The killer was also unable to perform sexually, which explained why there was no sign of sexual assault. It was likely that the victims knew the killer and trusted him. Indeed, before some of the disappearances, witnesses had reported seeing some of the kids willingly getting into a blue car. But despite what turned out to be an accurate FBI profile, the killer still roamed free. However, soon the killer began to make some changes that would ultimately be his undoing. The high mortality rate continued, but now he was disposing of the bodies in the Chattahoochee River. Then, as 1980 slipped into 1981 and the killings continued, the killer changed his M.O. and stopped killing kids. He began killing African American adults. On March 20th, 1981, 21-year-old Eddie Duncan, a mentally and physically disabled young man, disappeared. On April 8th, his body was pulled from the Chattahoochee River. The bodies of 3 more adult African American men were found shortly thereafter, 2 of them pulled from the Chattahoochee. The police started surveillance on a bridge over the river, a logical place for someone to dump a body. Making a splash. On the night of May 22nd, the surveillance paid off. Officers in a concealed location heard a big splash and intercepted a youngish, stocky African-American man driving on the bridge. His name was Wayne Williams. They questioned Williams closely, and he kept telling lies, saying that he was on his way to his girlfriend's house, except he told them the wrong phone number. They took Williams to headquarters for further questioning, but didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. 2 days later, the body of the oldest victim, 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater, was found in the Chattahoochee River. After further investigation, though, carpet fibers and dog hairs from Williams's home and car were found on victims, including Cater, the latest victim to be dropped into the river, and Williams was arrested. Police also found 5 bloodstains on the floor of his station wagon. The evidence, plus his lying, was circumstantial, but it was strong. Williams was put on trial for 2 murders, that of Nathaniel Cater and another adult named Jimmy Ray Payne, in January 1982, and it took the jury only 12 hours to find him guilty. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Some people believed that Williams was innocent, and others believed that the Ku Klux Klan had framed him. But there was one telling argument for his guilt. When Williams was locked up, the killings stopped. A change in M.O. One mystery in the Williams case is that, in an extremely rare departure for a serial killer, he started to murder adults. No one has been able to come up with a cogent theory as to why this might be. Chapter 21. Gary Ridgway. Notable quotable. I killed so many women, I can't keep straight how many. Gary Ridgway. One of the most notorious and frustrating serial killers in American history was the Green River Killer, so called because more than a few of his victims were fished out of the Green River near Seattle. It was years before he was caught, and over those years an astonishing number of bodies showed up. For example, between August 11th, 1982 and March 21st, 1983, 40 bodies were found. The police department demonstrated absolute incompetence when it came to investigating the cases. For example, in 1983, the driver's license of one of the victims, Marie Malver, was found at an airport, and police did not even pick it up to check for fingerprints. Bob Keppel, the brilliant Washington detective who did such outstanding work on the Ted Bundy case, was eventually called in to evaluate the quality of the investigation. He cited hundreds of errors. Another mistake was made in 1982. The policeman Dave Reichert came across the body of 16-year-old African-American Opal Mills. Her body was not yet in full rigor mortis, which meant she had died only recently. Hence, if the police had surveyed the river, they might have caught the killer in action and prevented untold deaths. But they didn't, and that chance was lost forever the next day when a local television station announced to the world that the police were going to start surveillance at Green River. As mentioned in other sections of this book, often police bring in the real killer for questioning, among a number of suspects, but he or she somehow slides through the net. This happened with Ridgway, a small, mousy-looking man who had, one writer pointed out, lips like a fish. He was interviewed because he liked picking up prostitutes, and said he choked one once because she bit him. But science marches on, and in September 2001, almost 20 years since the Green River killings had started, DNA analysis in the Washington State Crime Laboratory took a major leap forward. With the short tandem repeat, STR procedure, they could replicate a very small sample of evidence into a sample that was large enough to test. They did, and when they tested semen found on the bodies of 3 early victims, Marcia Chapman, Carol Christensen and Opal Mills, they linked them to a man named Gary Ridgway, who worked at the Kenworth truck plant. They linked Ridgway to another victim, and then arrested him on November 30th, 2001, and charged him with 4 murders. As it turned out, his body count would be astronomically higher. Early life. Gary Ridgway had a typical serial killer background. He wet the bed, and his mother, instead of nurturing and loving him, would march him out nude in front of his brothers and make him stand in a tub of cold water. In a confession, he said that he killed a young boy when he was a teenager. While they were swimming, he wrapped his legs around the little boy and forcefully held him under the water until he died. He was also extremely cruel to animals, once locking a cat in a refrigerator until it died. Afterward. Under questioning by investigators, to avoid the death penalty, Ridgway spoke about his compulsion to kill prostitutes, something he had first been aware of when stationed in the military in the Philippines. He had sex with prostitutes before he killed them, but after a while he started having sex with dead ones too. Not that bodies were new to him. His father was a funeral director, and one detective said that he wouldn't bet against the fact that Ridgway had sex with some of the deceased who passed through the mortuary. On May 5, 2003, Ridgway pled guilty to 48 murders and received 48 life sentences. But according to his calculations, he may well have killed up to 90 women. For portions of Ridgway's confession in his own words, see Chapter 38. Kill his own son? Once, Ridgway took a prostitute to a deserted area in his pickup, and his son accompanied him. Ridgway took the prostitute into the woods and killed her. When he returned to his truck, his son asked him where the woman was, and Ridgway said she lived nearby and walked home. When asked if he would have killed his son if the boy had happened upon his father when he was killing the prostitute, Ridgway responded, "I don't know." Chapter 22. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Notable quotable: "Give my baby back to me. I'll do anything you want." Victim Brenda O'Connor. "You're going to do anything we want, anyway." Leonard Lake. Employees from a San Francisco lumberyard noticed that a young man, who appeared to be Chinese, had boldly walked out of their store with a vise without paying for it. The man had placed the vise in a trunk of a Honda parked outside, and then closed the trunk and run away, inscrutably on foot. The employees called police, and when they showed up, they got a surprise. Instead of the Honda being empty, there was a 40-ish, bearded Caucasian man sitting blithely behind the wheel. The cops asked who he was, and he answered that his name was Robin Stapley. When asked for ID, the man produced a driver's license with the name he had given the cops. But there was a problem. The man looked nothing like the photo on the driver's license. When they opened the trunk to retrieve the stolen vise, they found a loaded .22 pistol. He had no license for the gun, and that, plus apparently being complicit to the theft, resulted in his arrest. At the station, house detectives questioned him, but he didn't answer them. He didn't say anything at all. A few hours into the interrogation, he popped something into his mouth and began to convulse. He was rushed to the hospital, where he lingered between life and death for 12 days until he passed away. The medical examiner determined that he had died of self-administered cyanide poisoning, and they discovered a secret compartment in his belt where he had hidden the pill. Why did he kill himself? For that matter, why was he carrying around a cyanide pill? The charges against him, gun possession and being complicit in theft, were not so bad, and he might have had an explanation for using Robin Stapley's ID as his own that would not end in an additional criminal charge. The investigation into these questions soon led to a horror story that would be hard to dream up. Investigators found evidence that many different people had been murdered, including some whose last moments had been videotaped as they were tortured, and it was clear that it didn't matter to Lake, or his co-conspirator Charles Chitot Ng, the man who had stolen the vise, whom they killed. For example, they murdered Harvey Dubbs, a San Francisco photographer, as well as his wife and the Dubs' infant son on July 25, 1984. And police saw young women being raped and tortured and murdered, and some mutilated on camera so badly that death was the only logical result. In addition to finding horrendous videotapes that were basically snuff films, investigators also found many still black-and-white photos showing women in various stages of nudity. Later, police would try to identify the women in the photos. They eventually found 6 of the 15 alive. The other 9, or at least most of them, were presumed to have been murdered. Police also found extensive diaries kept by Leonard Lake that detailed his compulsion to enslave, torture, and murder women. And they found bodies, lots of them, and a variety of people in the land surrounding Lake's bunker. Indeed, one of the investigators nicknamed it Lake and Ing Memorial Cemetery. Investigators found many skeletons and skeletal fragments, which told police there were likely more victims than they knew. Police also found a wide variety of stolen personal property. They used the vehicles and video equipment to identify the people who were missing or found dead. Monster Mash. At the heart of Ing and Lake's crimes was a twisted desire, bondage, torture, and death. Just why Ing came to enjoy this is hard to understand. He was born in Hong Kong in 1961 to wealthy parents and was always in trouble, expelled from schools in Hong Kong and England. He was a Marine, extremely violent, an expert in martial arts, and he loved guns, enough to steal $11,000 worth of automatic weapons from a Marine's arsenal in Hawaii with some co-conspirators. That was the end of his military career. He consequently deserted and was eventually caught, jailed, and dishonorably discharged. Lake's childhood, on the other hand, was clearly dysfunctional. He was about 15 years older than Ing, born on July 20th, 1946 in San Francisco. His mother was batty. She suggested that he glorify the human body by taking nude photos of women, but this encouraged him to become interested in pornography when young and to become involved with his sisters sexually. He also was into sadomasochism and bondage by the time he was a teenager, and this interest ultimately turned to obsession. Lake joined the Marines in 1966 and served as a non-combatant radio operator in Vietnam. While there, he was given 2 years of psychotherapy for unspecified mental maladies and was discharged in 1971. He married in 1980 and settled down in San Jose, California, where he gained a reputation as a gun lover and survivalist, and as someone who was sexually bizarre. He liked nothing better than to film women in bondage, and he was the ultimate male chauvinist pig, firmly believing that the only purpose of women was to cook, clean, and be sex slaves. He was married twice, the second time in 1981. Ing and Lake connected in 1981 when Lake answered an advertisement in a War Games magazine. The two men had a lot in common: love of violence, ex-Marines, and their regard for women as no more than slaves. They lived on a farm together in Ukiah, California, until police raided it for firearms violations. Ing was sentenced to 14 years, but served only 18 months, and Lake became a fugitive, living under a variety of assumed names. When Ing got out of jail, he again hooked up with Lake, who was living in a house in Wilseyville on 2.5 acres of wooded land. Lake built a bunker beside the house to store stolen equipment and, when he could, sex slaves. Notable quotable: "If you love something, let it go. If it doesn't come back, hunt it down and kill it." Leonard Lake. Notable quotable: "God meant women for cooking, cleaning house, and sex. And when they are not in use, they should be locked up." Leonard Lake. Afterward. Ing and Lake, one detective was to say later of them, are as crazy as bedbugs, and killing meant about as much to them as biting you would mean to a bedbug. Ing went on the run after the authorities searched his house, and he did not receive final justice for 15 years. On July 6, 1985, he was picked up for shoplifting in a market in Calgary, Canada. He fought extradition to the States, where he faced 25 felony charges, including multiple murders, and his uncooperativeness and legal maneuvers succeeded in delaying his extradition until 1991. Ultimately, he represented himself at trial, and the jury convicted him of 12 murders on May 3, 1999. The jury, unsurprisingly, recommended death. He is currently in prison, awaiting execution. Chapter 23. Eileen Wuornos. Notable quotable: "Scumbags of America, get raped." Eileen Wuornos, to the jury that convicted her of murder. One of the more interesting facts about serial killer Eileen Wuornos was that, unlike the vast majority of female serial murderers, she had an MO that men such as David Berkowitz and Robert Hansen had preferred: the gun. Women who kill tend to do it with more, feminine methods, such as poison, that don't have such an outward show of violence. Wuornos used a .22 caliber pistol and usually shot her victims at point-blank range. Anyone reading the horrific resume of Eileen Wuornos could have easily predicted that she was destined to murder someone someday. She was the carnal product of a teenage couple, and her father, a teenage pedophile in and out of mental hospitals, committed suicide. Her mother, Diane Pratt, could not stand the crying of Eileen and her brother Keith, so one day in early 1960 she left them with her parents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos. Their stay with their grandparents was tumultuous. Keith and Eileen possibly had sex, and the promiscuous Eileen gave birth to an illegitimate son at the ripe old age of 14 on March 23, 1971. The following July, their grandmother died, and their grandfather immediately wanted both kids out of the house. They became wards of the court, and Eileen started to work the streets as a teenage prostitute, serving time in prison for prostitution, theft, violence, and the assumption of false identities. Although she was young, anger was already boiling inside her. Once, in a bar in Troy, Michigan, a bartender angered her, and she threw a cue ball at his head, an act that might have at least put him in the hospital and quite possibly killed him had she connected. In 1976, Keith died of throat cancer, and she got a pleasant surprise. He had left her $10,000. Rather than use the money to help straighten out her life, she bought a new car, which she wrecked, and quickly spent the rest on bars, booze, and drugs. Around this time, she grew sick of Michigan winters and looked south toward a warmer climate and headed for Florida. Florida was a repeat of the beginning of her life, only more so. She was constantly stealing, serving time in jail, using aliases, and working the streets. However, in June 1986, Eileen met the great love of her life in a Daytona bar, the obese, nearly toothless lesbian, Tyra Moore. They started living together and seemed devoted to each other long after the sexual passion of their relationship had cooled. As the years went by, Eileen's anger became even more out of control. She would not back down from a fight in any situation, and she did not take insults lightly. She started carrying a gun, and the rage, resentment, and terror inside of her started getting close to the surface. She told Tyra that she was just waiting for the chance to kill someone because of what people had done to her over the course of her life. On November 30th, 1989, the body of a 51-year-old electrician from Palm Beach named Richard Mallory showed up in the woods northwest of Daytona Beach. He had been shot in the chest 3 times with a .22. After that, bodies of men were found in rapid succession. On June 1st, 1990, the body of 43-year-old David Spears was found in a wooded area about 40 miles north of Tampa. He had been shot 6 times with a .22. On June 6th, the body of 40-year-old Charles Karskadon was found. He had been shot 9 times, also with a .22. Cops noted the similarity in the killings, but as most police do, had not yet announced that there was a serial killer to avoid inciting panic. They did have one lead that summer: Peter Seams had been reported missing earlier in the year, and his wrecked car was found on July 4th in Orange Springs, Florida. Witnesses had seen two blonde women get out of the car, and when police investigated, they found a bloody palm print on the car's trunk. They lifted it and kept it for future reference. Soon, however, it became clear that Florida had a real problem on its hands. The body of Eugene Burris, age 50, was found fully clothed in Ocala National Forest on August 4th, 1990. He had been shot in the back and chest. A retired police chief from Alabama was discovered next, 56-year-old Dick Humphreys. His body was found in an unfinished housing development on September 12th. He had been shot 7 times with a .22. And then the body of Walter Antonio, a 60-year-old trucker, was found in the woods northwest of Cross City on November 19th, 1990. Now the police could no longer suppress what was going on, and the story of the murdered men exploded in the media. The police said they were looking for 2 blonde women in connection with the case. The police received calls identifying Tyra Moore and Lee Blahovic, one of Warnos's aliases, as the women they were looking for. The palm print confirmed that the blondes were involved. Officers tracked both women down, but they were not with each other at the time. Warnos was pawning tools and other items stolen from her victims, and Moore was at her sister's house. The investigators had a proposition for Moore. They wanted her to get Warnos to incriminate herself over the phone. With the cops listening, Tyra begged Eileen to confess to the killings for her sake. On June 16, 1991, Eileen confessed to 6 murders. She denied that she had killed Seams and a John Doe. This confession, plus the belongings of the men recovered from pawn shops and storage facilities where Eileen had sold or stashed them, was enough to convict. On January 27, 1992, Eileen Warnos was convicted of murder, and on January 28th, she was sentenced to death. Later, she was convicted of the other killings and received another death sentence. Black Widows. Eileen Warnos was entirely unlike a Black Widow killer. The nickname of such killers, of course, comes from the Black Widow spider, which kills its partner after mating. Human Black Widows are essentially the same. They usually start killing after the age of 25, and for a decade or longer, they systematically murder spouses, partners, family members, and indeed, anyone with whom they develop a personal relationship. They usually claim 6 to 8 victims over 10 to 15 years, though in places where law enforcement is lax, the victim count has reached as high as 13 or 14. Poison, particularly poisons that can't be easily detected, is the preferred MO. They should have known. Warnos's only defense in the Richard Mallory case was that she had been raped, and when the judge convicted her, she screamed out that she hoped the scumbags of America were raped. As it happens, no one had produced any evidence that Mallory was capable of a rape during the trial. But afterward, an enterprising reporter dug into his background and found through FBI computers that Mallory had indeed served 10 years for rape in another state, a fact that would have given tremendous credence to Warnos's claim. Part 3. Serial Killers Worldwide. America hardly is alone when it comes to serial murders and murderers. This part of the book represents stories about some of the worst killers in the world from a variety of countries. Chapter 24. Ivan Robert Marco Milat, Australia. Australia has some of the worst animal predators in the world. Dingoes that will snatch your baby from a carriage, snakes that make herpetologists quake, great white sharks cruising the waters of the Great Barrier Reef constantly looking for their next meal. However, in the late 1980s, there was a 2-legged predator afoot in Australia who holds the dubious honor of being Australia's worst killer. And he was far more dangerous than any animal. His bloodlust for human victims was combined with a cunning that no animal could ever begin to equal. In the end, like so many other serial killers, there is no telling how many people Ivan Robert Marco Milat, known as Marco, would have murdered had it not been for the raw courage of one young man, a British tourist named Paul Onions. Onions was hitchhiking near the Belongo State Forest in Sydney in January 1990 when a silver four-wheel drive vehicle stopped to pick him up. The driver, a well-tanned, tightly muscled man with a handlebar mustache, invited him to hop in. Onions took off his backpack, put it on the seat, and climbed in, and the two men started down the road. The driver said his name was Bill, and everything was fine at first, the two men making friendly conversation. Then, abruptly, Bill changed. He began probing into Onion's life with inappropriate questions that violated his personal privacy. Gradually, the man went into an enraged rant, filled with racist remarks, including invectives against foreigners such as Onions, who was becoming more and more nervous with the driver's turn towards psychosis. They were half a mile north of the Belongo State Forest when the driver suddenly pulled to the side of the road and, gun in hand, announced a robbery. The situation hardly seemed like a robbery. Why would a man driving an easily recognizable vehicle rob someone? What was he really going to do? Rob Onions and then let him go to the police? It didn't make sense. Onions drew the terrifying conclusion that he was going to be killed. Abruptly, leaving his backpack on the seat, Onions burst out the door and started to run toward the forest. It was a run for his life. The man with the handlebar mustache was chasing after him and shooting, the bullets coming perilously close. Onions zigzagged his way through the forest. Once inside, he was able to gradually work his way to the road. He frantically flagged down a passing car and poured out the story of what had just happened, and the driver took him to the nearest police station. The police recorded all the details of what had occurred and had Onions describe Bill to a sketch artist. Onions didn't know it at the time, but his chances of dying, had he not bolted from the car, were 100%. Without realizing it, he had encountered the serial killer, Ivan Robert Marco Milat. Gruesome murders. 2 years after Paul Onions was accosted, the bodies of two British women, 21-year-old Caroline Clark and 22-year-old Joanne Walters, were found in September 1992 at a place appropriately called Executioner's Drop in Belongo State Forest. The decomposing remains were not too far from where the driver of the silver car had picked up Onions. The last time the women had been seen was in mid-April, when they were planning on hitchhiking to Adelaide. The girls had been savagely attacked, and there were some strange elements to the murders. Joanne Walters had been stabbed in a frenzy, one wound thrust so deep that it penetrated her spine, and the medical examiner thought it might have paralyzed her. Curiously, the zipper on her jeans had been pulled down, but the top button fastened, almost as if the killer had raped her and then hastily buttoned her pants to somehow hide the assault. Caroline had also been stabbed repeatedly in a manic way and shot 10 times in the head. The ME theorized that the killer had actually used her head for target practice. Curiously, too, a primitive brick fireplace had been constructed at the scene of the murder, about 120 feet from the bodies. Its purpose was anyone's guess. The media speculated in headlines that a serial killer was on the loose. The police made no progress in solving the murders over the next few weeks, and eventually brought in the criminal profiler Dr. Rod Milton. He posited that the killer knew the area, was in his mid-30s, and had a history of aggression, but that he was not a serial killer. The profiler's analysis seemed accurate. No other bodies were discovered for a year. In 1993, 2 more bodies were found. The victims, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, who had been missing since 1989, were both 19-year-old Australians. There were similarities to the first crime scene. For one thing, the zipper on Gibson's pants was open, but the top button fastened. Both victims had been stabbed in a manic way, and a small brick fireplace had been built for no apparent reason at both crime scenes. An investigator theorized that the killer was trying to simulate or symbolize some kind of family home scene. The new discovery made it clear to the police that they had a serial killer on their hands, and the fact that these victims had disappeared 4 years before was a sign that there could be many undiscovered victims. A huge search was organized, and police and volunteers combed Belongo State Forest and the area around it. A month after the search started, there was another grim discovery: the body of a German woman, Simone Schmidl, who had been missing since January 1991. Like other victims, she had been hitchhiking, looking for work. The crime scene contained the same primitive fireplace and 22 shells. 3 days later, the bodies of 2 young Germans, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, were discovered, bringing the total to 7 known kills. The 2 had been savagely attacked. As in the previous case, the pants of the young man were unzipped but the top button fastened. He had been strangled and shot many times. The woman was headless, and from rough cuts on her neck, it seemed that she had been decapitated with some kind of machete or sword. Smoke and mirrors. One piece of evidence gave investigators pause in believing that Marco Milat murdered solo: the presence of cigarette butts at the crime scenes. Milat doesn't smoke. International aid. The police had been reluctant to announce that they had a serial killer on their hands, but a victim count of 7 left them with no choice. When they released the info, panic spread across Australia like wind bending wheat. Leads poured in. From the torrent of information that came in, several leads pointed to Ivan Robert Marco Milat. He was the son of a Yugoslavian couple who had 14 children. Milat, a well-muscled man who loved hunting, had been in trouble with the police, as had his brothers, since he was a teenager. Sometimes he was in big trouble. In 1971, he was tried for the knife-point rape of 2 female hitchhikers, but the case brought against him was weak, and he was acquitted. He had also been suspected of other rapes, but the cases went nowhere. However, the police had nothing definitive against Milat until word about the case had spread to other countries, when they heard from a Paul Onions who had barely escaped with his life back in 1990. Onions flew to Australia from his home in Birmingham, England, and when he arrived, he was shown a video lineup. Onions picked out Milat as the man who had tried to kill him. This allowed the police to get a warrant to search Milat's property at Eagle Vale, a suburb of Sydney, where Milat lived with his girlfriend. The investigators struck forensic gold at Milat's home. They found camping gear stolen from the victims and were able to connect firearms there to the killings. Unsolved mysteries. Police believe that Milat is guilty of many more rapes and murders than those that surfaced, including 6 Newcastle women and 6 tourists. These crimes date back to the early 1970s, a time when Milat was working in the area. Afterward. Milat was charged and brought to trial in July 1996. His lawyer tried to blame 2 of his brothers, Richard and Walter, for some of the murders, but that didn't work. Milat was convicted of 7 murders and received 6 life sentences, plus 6 years for trying to gun Onions down. Who am I? 1. I was born in Bingley, England. Considered the brightest of my parents' 6 children, I was also timid and something of a mama's boy who was bullied at school. I could spend hours in the bathroom preening myself in the mirror, but had no interest in girls. 2. In a strange paradox, one of my early jobs found me spending 3 years as a grave digger. I would quip, I have thousands of people below me at work. 3. I was devastated to learn that my mother had been having an affair with a policeman. I worshipped her. I believe I was so traumatized by the event that it's what precipitated my becoming a serial murderer. 4. Prostitutes were my primary victims. My M.O. would be to cave their skulls in with a hammer and then repeatedly stab and slash the dead body. 5. I stabbed one victim more than 50 times and gouged her back with a sharpened screwdriver. One veteran detective commented that after having seen the savagery of the attack, he was left numb with horror. 6. All of England was in an uproar over me, and the manhunt that mobilized was the biggest ever seen in Britain. It involved 304 full-time officers who interviewed 175,000 people. I was interviewed several times myself, but always released. 7. During one period of my 5-year reign of terror, someone claiming to be the killer sent a cassette tape and letters to the police. It turned out to be a cruel hoax that allowed me to kill 3 more women while the police concentrated on the misinformation. The hoaxer was never caught. 8. One evening, in an instance of blind luck, bad luck for me, the police spotted a prostitute getting into my car. She would surely have been my next victim. In the course of being questioned about soliciting a prostitute, the police discovered I had false license plates on the car. Brought in for further questioning, I finally admitted to the attacks. My confession took 17 hours to complete. 9. At my trial, I made claims that I had heard the voice of God telling me to rid the world of prostitutes. Several psychiatrists also stated that I was a paranoid schizophrenic, but despite my insanity defense, I was found guilty on 13 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. 10. I still think about my victims. I once said, "They are all in my brain, reminding me of the beast that I am. Just thinking of them reminds me what a monster I am." Still, the women I killed were filthy bastard prostitutes who were littering the streets. I was just cleaning up the place a bit. Answer: I am Peter Sutcliffe. Chapter 25. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, Canada. Notable fact: Carla told Paul that she would help him implement the rape of her little sister Tammy. All they had to do was drug Tammy into unconsciousness. With 3 killings under their collective belt, Paul Bernardo and his wife, Carla Homolka, hardly seem the most notorious of serial murderers. That is, until you get up close to the homicides they committed and realize that, had fate not intervened, they would have continued to kill ad nauseum. Paul and Carla also nicely demonstrate that when it comes to killers, you can't judge by appearances. After their crimes were discovered, someone in the media dubbed them the Ken and Barbie killers for their wholesome good looks. Both also had seemingly solid backgrounds. Paul, born in Scarborough, Ontario in 1964, had graduated from the University of Toronto. When people asked him what he did for a living, he told them he was an accountant. Carla was born in Port Credit, not far from Toronto, and graduated from high school. She was employed as a veterinary's assistant at the Martindale Animal Clinic, an experience that would provide invaluable when they started to murder people. An unholy union. In mid-October 1987, Carla, just 17 years old, attended a pet convention in Toronto. Paul, age 23, was there on business for his employer, Price Waterhouse. They spotted each other in the hotel restaurant, and sparks flew. Within hours, they were in one of the hotel's rooms, having white-hot sex. From the beginning, Paul's handsomeness and sophisticated ways dominated Carla, even mesmerized her. They started going steady. In 1990, Paul was fired from his accounting job at Price Waterhouse. Rather than try to get a new job, he started smuggling cigarettes into Canada and engaged in other criminal activities. To make matters worse, he was also named a suspect in a series of 14 rapes that had occurred in Scarborough. The Metro Toronto Police asked him to furnish them with blood, saliva, and hair samples for DNA testing. Bernardo complied, but there was a major screw-up. The forensic unit did not immediately test the samples. If they had, they almost surely would have come up with a match, and Bernardo would have been arrested for rape, and 3 young girls would likely have lived. Even though he was unemployed and suspected of being a rapist, in Carla's eyes, Bernardo could do no wrong. Indeed, the depth of her adulation was such that Paul felt comfortable revealing a deep, sick fantasy to her. He wanted to take the virginity of Carla's attractive 15-year-old sister, Tammy. Excitedly, Carla told him she would help him implement the fantasy, that all they had to do was drug Tammy into unconsciousness, and then Paul could have his way with her. And Carla said she had the perfect drug for it, halothane, an anesthetic used on animals. Bernardo liked the plan, and the couple decided to put it into action on Christmas Eve in 1990. Carla cooked Christmas dinner for her family, adding halothane to Tammy's food. She also encouraged her younger sister to have a few drinks. As the night wore on, other family members retired to bed, but Paul, Carla, and Tammy went into the basement recreation room, where they continued to drink. Eventually, Tammy passed out. Carla held a rag saturated with halothane over Tammy's mouth and nose, while Bernardo brutally raped her. Bernardo also ordered Carla to engage in sex acts with her sister, which she did. They recorded the whole event with a camcorder. Then there was a problem. Tammy awoke and started to throw up and choke on her vomit. Carla and Paul tried to clear her air passages, but they were unsuccessful. The teen choked to death. Quickly, they cleaned her up, dressed her, and called 911. When the paramedics came, nothing at the scene aroused suspicion, and Tammy's death was ruled accidental. Sadomasochism. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka based their sexual relationship on sadomasochism, or S&M. In fact, the first time they had sex, Bernardo used handcuffs to shackle Carla to the bed and pretend to rape her. The crimes escalate. The death of Tammy had no chastening effect on Carla or Paul. Less than a month later, Paul picked up a teenage girl in his car, drove her to the Homolka house, which was empty at the time, and raped her in Carla's bedroom. Afterward, Paul simply drove her out of the neighborhood and dropped her off. The young girl was so terrorized that she never reported the assault to the police. This was followed by yet another rape, but this time, as with her little sister, Carla presented a 15-year-old girl to Paul as a sick, twisted gift. Carla had invited the girl to dinner in a house she and Paul had rented in the suburb of St. Catherine, where they knocked her out with drinks and halothane. Paul raped the teenager, with, again, Carla videotaping the whole thing. The girl was released unharmed, but their crimes were escalating toward the inevitable: murder. During one of his illicit smuggling trips across the border into the United States, Bernardo spotted a teenager. She was just 14 years old, standing outside a house alone. He approached her and found that she had been locked out of her house. Bernardo then lured her into his car and kidnapped her, taking her to his and Carla's place in St. Catherine. The girl, Leslie Mahaffey, was raped, sexually abused, and beaten by both Bernardo and Homolka for an entire day, the camcorder on the whole time. The next day, June 14, 1991, the couple realized that releasing Mahaffey would put them at risk of arrest. They decided to murder her, something Bernardo, who had the heart and soul of a serial murderer, likely had in mind all along. Bernardo strangled her with an electric cord, and they used a chainsaw to cut her up. They encased the pieces in concrete and threw them in Lake Gibson. Another torture and murder followed just less than a year later, when they lured the teenager Kristen Dawn French to their car and overpowered and kidnapped her. They took French to their home for a videotaped 3-day rape and torture fest that later even hardened police had trouble viewing. Bernardo strangled her on April 16, 1992, Easter Sunday. Blast from the past. The beginning of the end came for both Bernardo and Homolka when police finally tested the blood, saliva, and hair samples Bernardo had given more than 2 years earlier, in November 1990, for the Scarborough rapist case. The DNA proved he was the rapist, the first of those crimes having occurred in 1987, right around the time he met Carla. On February 17, 1993, Bernardo was arrested and interrogated for 8 hours. 2 days later, armed with a search warrant, police invaded the rented house where Bernardo and Homolka lived. They did not find much that was incriminating during their search, but they did find a major ally in prosecuting Bernardo: Carla. In a fit of rage the previous December, Bernardo had beaten Carla to a pulp. Afraid for her own life, she had filed a complaint with the police. When the police came knocking, after arresting Paul for the Scarborough rapes, Carla told them through her lawyer that she would lay out exactly what had happened in the house. A kind of legal ping-pong followed, with both Paul and Carla denying any culpability in the rapes and deaths of the teenagers. Ultimately, Homolka plea-bargained a great deal by testifying against Bernardo. She received only 12 years, while Bernardo was found guilty of the murders and rapes and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Afterward. In an attempt to discredit Carla's testimony and prove her involvement in the murders, Bernardo told his lawyers about their murder and torture tapes, and that they were hidden in the ceiling of a bathroom on the second floor of their rented house. As gruesome as they were, the tapes did not manage to derail the plea bargain Homolka made. Ultimately, because of their mind-bending content, the tapes were destroyed in 2001, when there was no further legal use for them. Bernardo has appealed his sentence, but was turned down. Unbelievably, Carla Homolka, a conspirator in first-degree murder, was released from prison in 2005. Who are we? 1. We are American serial killers who met while we were both inmates in the California State Prison in San Luis Obispo. But we are soul brothers to killers like Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. One of us was a sociopathic career criminal, and the other was a schizoid sex offender. 2. While in prison, we discovered that we shared a mutual fantasy of kidnapping, raping, torturing, and murdering teenage girls. We plotted a game in which we would kidnap 7 victims, 1 victim for each of the teenage years, from 13 to 19 years old. 3. After being released from prison, we teamed up to live out our depraved fantasies. We bought a 1977 GMC cargo van with a sliding door on the side and cruised the towns and beaches along the Pacific Coast Highway. If the girls didn't accept our offer of a ride, we pulled them in through the side door. We nicknamed the van Murder Mac. 4. We wound up with 5 young victims. Our savage acts included repeated rapes, shoving an ice pick through their ears into their brains, hitting them with a sledgehammer, and strangling them with a wire coat hanger. We dumped the bodies off the sides of a cliff in the San Gabriel Mountains. 5. We would sometimes record our sadistic acts using a Polaroid camera or a tape recorder. The more the girls suffered, the more we enjoyed it. We would turn up the radio to drown out their anguished cries. We would taunt them by saying things like, "Scream, baby, scream." 6. Our downfall came after one of us bragged about our activities to an old prison buddy. The friend told his lawyer, who went to the police. 7. The trial was difficult to watch. Between the playing of the audio tape of a girl being tortured and the testimony that detailed the brutality, some spectators had to get up and leave the courtroom. Even the district attorney, emotionally hardened as he was from the cases he had prosecuted, wept on 2 occasions. 8. We were found guilty of 5 counts of murder and a multitude of other offenses and have been incarcerated since 1980. One of us sits on death row in San Quentin, and the other, sentenced to 45 years to life, is in Pelican Bay State Prison awaiting a parole hearing, scheduled for 2010. Answer. We are Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. Chapter 26. Pedro Lopez, Colombia. Notable fact. When he was released, an already disturbed mind had been damaged even more. The childhood of Pedro Alonso Lopez is a serial killer classic. Lopez was born on October 8, 1948, in a squalid hovel, one of 13 children of a prostitute. When he was 8 years old, his mother caught Pedro having intercourse with one of his younger sisters. His mother, a domineering, brutal person, threw him out of the house. For days, Pedro wandered the streets of Tolima, a homeless 8-year-old with no idea what to do. After a few days, Pedro caught a break. A kindly man noticed him and asked what had happened. Pedro told him that his mother had thrown him out of the house. The man commiserated and told Pedro that he could stay at his house for a while, and he promised Pedro food. Pedro went with the man, but instead of taking him to his house, the man took him to an abandoned building where he sodomized Pedro and made him fillet him. When he was released, an already disturbed mind had been damaged even more, and Pedro found himself terrified of everyone, living like a rat on the run, sleeping in building entrances and empty market stalls, eating garbage. Eventually, a kindly American family found Pedro and took him into their home in Bogota, and he was allowed to grow up like a normal boy. But the damage had already been done. When Pedro was 12, he stole some money from his adoptive family and ran away, later claiming that he had absconded because a teacher had made sexual advances toward him. However, it's far more likely that Pedro simply felt compelled to do something like that. His mother and the man who assaulted him had irrevocably affected his personality. Growing up. Another trauma resulted in the emergence of the real Pedro, in all his malignant glory. When Pedro was 18, he was imprisoned for stealing a car. On the second day he was in prison, a new fish, as inmates say, 4 other prisoners cornered him and brutally sodomized him. Bleeding and in pain, Lopez did not report the assault to the authorities. Instead, he plotted revenge, making himself a shank. Over the next 2 weeks, he cornered 3 of the 4 men who had raped him and stabbed them to death. When the authorities discovered his murders, the court determined Lopez's assaults to be self-defense and gave him just 2 years of extra time. What the court didn't seem to recognize was Lopez's ability to kill with impunity. Girl Killer. When he was released from prison, Lopez embarked on a murderous rampage through 3 countries, killing young girls between 8 and 12 years old. He began in Peru, where he would one day estimate that he killed at least 100 young indigenous girls. To Lopez, the young indigenous children were easy game. Peruvian police didn't really care about them and considered them substandard, not worth helping. But one day, Lopez made a mistake that almost cost him his life. He was in the process of leading a 9-year-old Indian girl from her village when some villagers spotted him, ran him down, and rescued the girl. They stripped him, tortured him for hours, and were about to bury him alive when a female American missionary happened by and begged them to spare his life. The missionary and her party promised to turn Lopez over to Peruvian authorities. Very reluctantly, the community agreed, and the missionary and her party kept their word and turned him in to the Peruvian authorities, who made an unthinkable mistake born of insensitivity. They deported him, in effect releasing a crazed, homicidal pedophile. Lopez started to travel, dividing his time between Colombia and Ecuador. Like a seasoned predator, he learned to select victims who would be trusting and offer the least resistance. Although authorities in all 3 countries, Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia, were aware that there were a lot of young girls missing, no one really had a handle on just how bad it was. In fact, they thought that sex slave traders were kidnapping the girls. But then, a few coincidental events combined to ultimately bring Lopez to justice. Flash flood. In April 1980, there was a flash flood near the town of Ambato, Ecuador. The local river swelled in size and brought forth some horrific secrets, the remains of 4 young girls. This broke open the sordid story. Slave traders weren't kidnapping girls. There was a serial killer on the loose. A few days later, a woman named Carvina Poveda saw something terrifying as she was shopping. A man was walking her 12-year-old daughter out of the marketplace. Poveda ran after them, yelling for help. People stopped the man and held him there as the police were called. When police arrived, they immediately suspected that they might have caught a big fish with this Pedro Lopez. Indeed, they had caught a whale. After his capture, Lopez was mute. No matter how hard they tried, police couldn't get him to talk. Knowing that Lopez was likely no ordinary criminal, the police came up with a plan and asked a priest to help. The priest dressed up like a convict and was put into Lopez's cell. Using the skills he had developed in years of talking to people, the priest started to talk to Lopez and gradually began to drag a confession out of him by trading criminal war stories. When authorities felt they had gotten Lopez to admit enough, they halted the ruse and came at Lopez with a withering interrogation. Lopez broke down and gave it up, as police say, and what he gave up was incredible, hard to believe. Lopez said that he had murdered more than 100 young girls in his native Colombia, 110 in Ecuador, a country he liked because of the trusting nature of the young girls, and more than 100 in Peru. The police wanted proof of what Lopez said, so shortly after his confession, Lopez gave them a guided tour of an area around Ambato, Ecuador, where police eventually unearthed the remains of 53 young girls. Lopez showed them many other grave sites, but the remains were gone, taken by animals. Ecuadorian authorities now believed Lopez. They charged him with 110 murders. Notable quotable: "I like the girls in Ecuador. They are more gentle and trusting. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls." Pedro Lopez. Afterward. Lopez explained his murderous method to police after his confession. He would reconnoiter crowded marketplaces looking for likely victims, and when he found one, he would wait until she came to the market again. He would follow her, then shepherd her away, and once alone, he would rape and then strangle her to death. He said he enjoyed looking into their eyes as he killed them so that he could observe their agony, watch the light go out of their eyes as he applied pressure. He always found the experience sexually stimulating. He also said that he hunted in daylight so that he could be sure to see the girls' pain as they died. He also killed as quickly as he could, sometimes more than one victim each day, and the more he murdered, the more he needed to murder. Ecuadorian authorities, of course, shared information with those of Peru and Colombia, and Lopez provided enough details to amply demonstrate that his confessions in those countries were valid. Incredibly, following his trial in Ecuador, Lopez was sentenced to only 16 years, but when he gets out, he is scheduled to be tried in Colombia, where they have the death penalty. Notable quotable: "I lost my innocence at 8. So I decided to do the same to as many young girls as I could." Pedro Lopez. Chapter 27. Dennis Nilsen, England. Notable quotable: "Well, enjoying it is as good a reason as any." Dennis Nilsen on why he killed. There's a concept in police work called linkage, where investigators use the sameness in the methods that a murderer employs to help find the killer. They are able to link all the crimes together and learn something about the killer from the circumstances. Unfortunately, this did not occur when police investigated the murders and assaults committed by Scotland-born Dennis Nilsen, though there were revelatory similarities. If they had, a number of lives might well have been saved. Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland. His childhood was traumatic. His mother and father were constantly arguing until his father, an alcoholic, moved away when Nilsen was 4. His mother and 2 siblings then moved into her mother's house, and Nilsen immediately bonded with his grandfather. When he was only 6 years old, his grandfather died. Eventually, his mother remarried and had 4 more children, and the situation enhanced his feelings of being left out, alone and uncared for. He was lost in a crowd, and there was something else that isolated him from his peers. At a very young age, he started to feel romantically attracted to boys. But though he had the feelings, he did not act on them. A new country. His family moved to England when Dennis was still a boy, and in 1961, when he was 16, Dennis joined the Army Catering Corps. He was to learn a skill there that served him well during his murderous rampage: butchering. Following his departure from the Army in 1972, he joined the police force and stayed for a year. A special treat for him certainly was access to the morgue and autopsies, which fed into the necrophiliac tendencies that had been building inside him for years, tendencies that would later manifest in some truly shocking ways. He started acting on his homosexual urges while he was working as a civil servant at a London job centre employment agency. Nilsen was attracted to a young co-worker named Painter, and one day he took various photos of him while he was asleep. Painter caught Nilsen. The experience traumatized Painter, who had to be hospitalized. The police were notified and questioned Nilsen, but they released him without filing any charges. Eventually, Nilsen could no longer control his sexual feelings, and in 1975 he started a relationship with a man named Gacy. After 2 years, Gacy ended the relationship, and it was as if a bomb had gone off inside Nilsen's psyche. He spiraled down into an unbearable pit of loneliness and became like a child again, with his feelings of abandonment. He tried to hold off the anxiety with drink, but this didn't work. Bizarre murders. He started to take young men home to his apartment in the Cricklewood section of London, and the homicidal urges that had been gestating in him for years finally blossomed, and then some, on the evening of December 29th, 1978. He picked up a young man in a local pub, and they had sex all night. When the young man got ready to leave the next morning, Nilsen used a necktie to strangle him and immersed his head in a bucket of water to make sure that he died. The next day, Nilsen carefully and lovingly washed the nude corpse from head to toe, and that evening placed the body onto his bed and laid down beside it. He spent much of the night marveling at the beauty of the corpse, and at one point he became aroused and tried to have sex with it, but was unsuccessful. He spent the entire night with the dead young man. When dawn came, Nilsen decided to dispose of the body. He carefully pried up the floorboards and laid the body between the wooden frames. Why? Why not just take the body out in the dead of night and dump it somewhere? Author Brian Masters, who collaborated with Nilsen on his biography, Killing for Company, says that Nilsen was again warring against the abandonment of his childhood. The body under the floorboards was not dead to him. Because the body was there, he was not alone. Indeed, Nilsen had what might be characterized as a very quiet roommate until 8 months after the murder, when, in August, he brought it outside to the garden area and cremated the corpse in a bonfire. A few months after Nilsen cremated his first victim, he tried to kill again, this time a young Chinese man named Andrew Ho. Ho broke free and reported the incident to police. An officer who was a former colleague of Nilsen's questioned him, and Nilsen explained the assault away as a botched robbery. The cop believed his old acquaintance. Less than 2 months later, on December 3, 1979, Nilsen committed his second homicide. The details of this murder were even more bizarre than the first. Nilsen met the victim, a Canadian tourist named Kenneth Ockendon, at a pub, and they hit it off. The two spent the day drinking and sightseeing, and then retired to Nilsen's apartment for a grand sexual finale to their day. Instead, Nilsen strangled the young man with an electrical cable. Then, just as he had with the first victim, Nilsen carefully washed the corpse, placed it in bed next to him, and spent the night with it. This time, though, there was a variation on his ghoulish theme. Nilsen took photos of the body, and this time succeeded in having sex with it. As before, he stored it under the floorboards, but, even more bizarrely, in the days that followed, he would periodically remove it and frequently had conversations with it. 7 months after Ockendon's murder, Nilsen lured a 19-year-old homeless Irish man named Martin Duffy to his house, and there strangled him and submerged his head in a bucket of water. Then he cleaned Duffy as he had done the other victims, placed his body on the bed, had sex with it, and placed it in a wardrobe for 2 weeks before storing it under the floorboards with the decomposing remains of Ockendon. Nilsen's homicidal pattern continued, and during the next 3 years, Nilsen murdered a total of 13 men, storing all of them in whatever space was available, in the cupboard, a closet, under the floorboards, a shed in the garden. The stench that had been building in his apartment got worse and worse, and though Nilsson tried to control it with various sprays, he never completely succeeded. He knew he had to dispose of the bodies, so he enlisted the butchering skills he had learned in the army. He skillfully cut up the remains and incinerated them in a mammoth backyard bonfire, tossing an old tire into the blaze to explain the stench. During this time, a number of people that Nilsson had attacked survived, or he would attack them and then unaccountably stop. A number of these victims reported his assaults to the police, and this is where the linkage failed. Similar complaints about Nilsson trying to garrote or drown people went unrecognized as a pattern, and no deeper investigation was done. New digs. Nilsson moved from his Cricklewood apartment in 1981, but his quest for new companions continued. This time, however, he used a new way to dispose of the bodies. He butchered them into pieces small enough to flush down the toilet. It was the plumbing in his apartment that finally unraveled Nilsson. Although he tried gruesome means of making the human pieces pass through the plumbing, including removing flesh from skulls by boiling them, neighbors were having troubles with clogged toilets and called a company called Dino Rod. The technician found the clog and removed rotting pieces of human remains, some pieces clearly distinguishable by the hair attached to them, in front of horrified onlookers, including Nilsson. The police were summoned. Police conducted a search of the entire apartment building, and it wasn't long before they got to Nilsson's apartment. They were greeted by a scene reminiscent of Ed Gein's apartment or the future Jeffrey Dahmer's. Stored all over the place was a vile assortment of heads, legs, arms, torsos, and viscera. Afterward. When Nilsson went on trial at Central Criminal Court in October 1983 for 6 murders and 2 attempted murders, there was never any question about his guilt, just whether he was innocent by reason of insanity. His lawyer, Ivan Lawrence, said that at the time of each killing he was in such an abnormal mental state that he was not capable of forming the intent needed to be guilty of murder. The trial turned into a battle royale of psychiatric experts, but in the end, Nilsson was found guilty by a vote of 10-2 and sentenced to life in prison. Chapter 28. Henri Landru, France. Notable fact. It is said Landru was the real-life inspiration for Charlie Chaplin's black comedy, Monsieur Verdoux. A Bluebeard is a man who kills his wives. It started with a 15th-century man named Guy de Rais, who had a blue-black beard and was a child killer. Somehow, the term became attached to a folk-tale about a man named Chevalier Raoul, whose 7th wife discovered the bodies of his first 6 in a room he had forbidden her to enter. However, 20th-century Henri Landru seems to have taken permanent possession of the word. One of the curious things about Landru was that, though he seemed to have no problem attracting females, he was hardly the cliché image of an attractive man. He was a short, stocky, balding man with a long red beard. It is said Landru was the real-life inspiration for Charlie Chaplin's black comedy, Monsieur Verdoux, in which an unattractive man supports his family by marrying and murdering rich women for their money. But Landru appeared extremely charming and caring, and he came across as someone who had all that it took to appeal to women, a persona that was obviously a performance because he cared nothing about his victims except for their wealth. Perhaps his success with women was mostly a matter of timing. When World War I started in 1914, he had already been in the Army, having been discharged in 1894 after 4 years of service. Hence, he was one of the few men available for the host of women keeping the home fires burning. A life of crime. This Bluebeard's career in crime kicked off in 1900, when he was 31 years old, when he spent 2 years in jail for fraud. That was followed by additional stints in jail for fraud, 2 years in 1904 and a little more than a year in 1906. In 1908, he was again convicted of fraud, and sentenced to 3 years, and later managed to get himself an additional 3 years for having swindled 15,000 francs from a woman he had lured into his clutches with what would become his stock in trade, a lonely heart's ad. By the start of the war, he was tried and convicted in absentia of various crimes and sentenced to 4 years and permanent deportation to New Caledonia. Unfortunately, for a series of women, he was not captured for quite a while. One of these women, drawn by one of his lonely heart's ads, was Madame Couchet, who took up residence with him in 1914. Landru told her his name was Diard. He met her family, who didn't like Diard, and warned her against involvement, but she was smitten and set up a household with him and her 16-year-old son in the town of Vernouillet. By January 1915, both Couchet and her son had gone missing, and Landru got away with 5,000 francs. 6 months later, one of his ads lured a Madame Labordeline, and she went to live with Landru in Vernouillet, but not for long. By the end of June, she was missing, and the not exactly grief-stricken Landru immediately sold her securities and possessions. Just over a month later, on August 2nd, 51-year-old Madame Guyin went to live with him at Vernouillet. Predictably, she disappeared only a few days after she arrived. Landru sold off her securities and was able to withdraw 12,000 francs from her bank account with forged documents. Landru waited until near the end of the year before striking again, this time luring a Madame Hillon to a villa he had rented in Gambay in the south of France. Soon he was writing plaintive letters to relatives who had inquired after her that she was too ill to visit them. Of course, she had gone way past the point of sickness. She was his 5th murder victim. The 6th victim was Madame Gambay, who met Landru in November 1916. By Christmas Day, she was missing, and he was in possession of her assets. Illicit profit was undoubtedly Landru's main motivation for killing, but he was a serial killer at heart and didn't necessarily need financial gain to murder. Buttressing this belief is the fact that he killed one female who didn't have any money. At the end of the war, he met Andrée Babelet, a servant girl who was much younger than Landru. She told her mother that she was getting married, and then she left to move in with Landru. By April 12th, she was gone with the wind, never to be seen again. Landru continued his homicidal Houdini act with a number of other women, but like most serial killers, he eventually went too far. 2 families, the Colombes and Buissons, who had lost daughters to Landru, applied pressure to the police to take action. Finally, on April 2nd, 1919, they arrested him. It was then that Landru's meticulousness in thievery and murder backfired. Police found a notebook containing cryptic notes about all his victims, 11 in all, and they launched a full-scale investigation, including digging out the land around his villa. The search unearthed nothing incriminating, but inside the house, they found articles of clothing and other possessions that could be traced to the victims. This evidence, plus the notebook, weighed heavily against Landru. At his trial in Versailles in November 1919, he was found guilty. He appealed, but on February 23, 1922, he met the guillotine and was no longer a threat to lonely women. The Secret in the Frame. On the day he was to be guillotined, Henri Landru framed some of his drawings and gave them to his attorneys. 5 decades later, the frame was opened, revealing Landru's confession and explaining how he disposed of the bodies. Chapter 29. Peter Kürten, Germany. Notable quotable. In the case of Oliger, I also sucked blood from the wound on her temple, and from Scheer from the stab in the neck. From the girl Schultz, I only licked the blood from her hands. It was the same with the swan in the Hofgarten. I used to stroll at night through the Hofgarten very often, and in the spring of 1930 I noticed a swan sleeping at the edge of the lake. I cut its throat. The blood spurted up, and I drank from the stump. Peter Kürten. Peter Curtin was so twisted that serial murderer superstars like Albert Fish would have been proud to call him brother. His life was truly off the scale of perversity. Perhaps the most telling incident is that, when he was sentenced to death by guillotine, he commented that his greatest thrill of all time would be that millisecond as the guillotine sliced his head off and he heard the sound of his own blood jetting from his neck. If this sounds like false bravado, think again. On July 2nd, 1931, he went to the guillotine with an anticipatory smile on his face. A horrid beginning. Like most other serial murderers, Curtin didn't have much of a chance for normalcy from the beginning. He was born in Cologne-Mulheim, Germany, in 1883. Economic circumstances forced him to live with 10 other family members in a single room. His father was a sadistic drunk who forced his wife to strip nude in front of the other family members and have sex with him. His father also tried to rape his 13-year-old daughter and was sent to prison. Of course, the psychotic, as it were, doesn't fall far from the tree. Peter also had sex with a number of his sisters. But incest was hardly abnormal enough for Curtin. As he grew up, he also came to enjoy homicidal bestiality. A dog catcher who lived upstairs tutored Curtin on how to torture all kinds of animals. As a teenager, he had sex innumerable times with a wide variety of creatures, including goats, sheep, pigs, and dogs, either sodomizing them or masturbating with them as nature allowed. He took particular pleasure in stabbing sheep to death and watching the blood spurt from them as he had intercourse with them. Such an activity would frequently bring him to orgasm. Curtin committed his first murder, actually 2 murders, at the ripe old age of 9. He was with another boy on a raft in the Rhine River, and Curtin pushed the boy into the water. A mutual friend jumped into the river to save him, and Curtin was able to keep both boys from getting on the raft, instead forcing them to go under it and drown. Investigating authorities determined that the deaths were a tragic accident, and Curtin was free to kill again. As if all this weren't enough, Curtin also dabbled in other criminal activities. He was a habitual thief, caught for the first time when he was 15, also the first time he was in prison, where he ultimately spent 27 of his 47 years on Earth. Curtin was also an arsonist. His specialty was barns and haystacks, frames for carrying hay. As they burned to the ground, he would masturbate furiously to orgasm, not only feeling the triumph of the chaos he had caused, but also hoping that there were people trapped inside. Life of crime. Curtin claimed that he had tried to commit his first adult homicide in 1899, but he may not have actually succeeded. He was having sex with a woman near Dusseldorf and said he strangled her, but no corpse was ever found, and she may have just been choked to unconsciousness and woke up after he left. He continued to commit a variety of crimes over the next few years, and eventually received a prison term for theft and fraud that kept him behind bars until 1904. Despite his extensive criminal record, Curtin was drafted into the German military when he was freed from prison. He then deserted and surfaced again in 1905, when he was arrested and sentenced to 7 years for theft. It should be noted that criminal activity for Curtin hardly stopped when he went to jail. Indeed, he would later confess to poisoning a number of inmates in the prison hospital. Curtin was free again by 1912, and he celebrated his liberty by raping a young servant girl. Soon afterward, he accosted some young women in a restaurant. When a waiter tried to intervene, Curtin pulled a pistol and fired at the man, who fled for his life. His freedom, then, was short-lived. He was back in jail for another year over the shooting incident. In the years that followed, Curtin continued his rampage of rape, arson, thievery, and, of course, murder. But he confounded police because his victims were not from the same group, just anyone who seemed available. Therefore, he had no pattern, and police couldn't figure out how the victims in crimes could be related. They didn't realize that one man was committing all of them. There had been attacks on men, young women, and children. On the night of May 25, 1913, he broke into a bar in Cologne, Mulheim. The owners, who lived in an apartment above the bar, happened to be away, but when Curtin got to the top of the stairs, he discovered their daughter, 13-year-old Christine Klein. He sexually assaulted her with his fingers and cut her throat. On the night of February 19th, 1929, a drunken man named Rudolf Scheer accidentally bumped into Curtin, who responded by pouncing on him and stabbing him repeatedly with scissors, at the same time sucking up the blood that spurted from a neck wound. No one was safe. To further obscure the fact that his crimes belonged to a single perpetrator, he used whatever weaponry was available: hands, knife, hatchet, gun, garrote, and fire. The one consistent thing about Curtin's actions was that he was capable of white-hot violence in a heartbeat, and anyone was fair game. Indeed, when he proposed to his prospective wife, a woman who had spent 5 years in jail for shooting her fiancé, she originally refused, but he made her an offer she couldn't refuse. "Marry me, or I'll kill you." She knew he would, and they were soon off on their honeymoon. The Monster of Dusseldorf. All of Peter Curtin's life as a brutal, sadistic, vampire-like murderer might be considered a mere warm-up for 1929, the year he turned 46 years old. It was during that year that he richly earned the nickname Monster of Dusseldorf. The carnage that terrorized the city started with the killing of 8-year-old Ruth Oliger on the night of February 8th. Her body was discovered at a construction site on March 9th. She had been raped and stabbed 13 times, including puncture wounds in the temples, which investigators noted had happened to 3 other recent homicide victims. In his confession, Curtin would say that he sucked blood from Oliger's temple. Like other serial killers, the concept of oral incorporation was very arousing to him, and he did it as frequently as possible. Small wonder that he was also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Curtin attacked 5 people in August, 3 of whom survived, and 2 who did not. 14-year-old Louise Lenzen and 5-year-old Gertrude Homaker died after being raped, strangled, and stabbed. Before the month was out, Curtin also had approached Gertrude Schult and asked for sex in an obscene way. Gertrude said she would rather die, so Curtin tried to oblige, stabbing her several times in the chest. She survived and described Curtin to the police, who were still not able to put the case together as the work of one person. The murderous blitzkrieg continued as the year wound down. In September, Curtin tried to strangle 3 more women. In October, 2 women were bludgeoned to death with a hammer. On November 9th, the corpse of another 5-year-old, Gertrude Alberman, was found. Alberman had received 36 frenzied stab wounds and had been strangled. And for good measure, Curtin, like so many other attention-hungry serial killers, sent instructions to police on where they could find the body of Maria Hahn. Hahn had also died in August, stabbed 20 times, and raped post-mortem. The city of Dusseldorf was panicked about the seemingly random death and violence haunting the city, and as such, residents were on high alert for the killer. On May 14th, 1930, Curtin made a big mistake. He was on a date with Maria Budlick. While they were strolling through the woods, he pounced on her. In the middle of strangling her, he suddenly asked her whether she remembered where he lived, in case he had to help her, and she gave the right answer: no. He released her, and shortly thereafter, the police were knocking on his door. Notable quotable: "The whole family suffered through his drinking, for when he was in drink, my father was terrible. I, being the eldest, had to suffer most. As you may well imagine, we suffered terrible poverty, all because the wages went on drink. We all lived in one room, and you will appreciate what effect that had on me sexually." Peter Curtin, talking about his father. Afterward. Curtin's trial, held on April 3, 1931, was open and shut. He had given prosecutors a highly detailed confession, and jurors came back with a guilty verdict in 90 minutes. Curtin was sentenced to death, and he died on July 2, 1931, his final turn-on. Notable quotable: "The man curtain is a riddle to me. I cannot solve it. The criminal Harmon only killed men. Landru and Grossman only women. But Peter killed men, women, children, and animals. Killed anything he found." Dr. Vina, Peter Curtin's defense counsel. Chapter 30. Béla Kiss, Hungary. Notable fact: instead of petrol, each of the drums was filled with the decomposing corpse of a nude female. There is no question that Béla Kiss, a Hungarian tinsmith who went on a murderous, undetected rampage around the time of World War I, was one of the cagiest serial killers of all time. Kiss apparently didn't start to kill people until he was in his 40s, which is extremely rare for a serial killer. Usually they begin in their 20s. And some people believe that a single event triggered his descent into murder. In February 1912, 40-year-old Béla was happily taking his new bride, Marie, 15 years his junior, to his house in Zinkota. But within weeks of taking her marriage vows, she had also taken on a lover, a man named Paul Beccari. Kiss was not too close to his neighbors. He was a known sorcerer and had a certain weirdness about him that kept the neighbors at arm's length. Few would approach his house. However, they did observe that, within weeks of his marriage, his new bride did not seem to be around, and that periodically young women would visit. Near the end of the year, someone got up the gumption to approach and ask where Marie was. Kiss's heartfelt, sad response was that she had left him for another man. The parade of women into his house was left unexplained. The neighbors also noticed something else. As time went by, Kiss started to collect large metal drums, and when the local constable questioned him about them, Kiss said they were filled with petrol. That because World War I was looming on the horizon, gas would become scarce. The constable had no reason to question what Kiss said. In 1914, World War I started, as Kiss and many others had predicted. Although he was 42 years old at the time, Kiss was drafted into the army. Before he left for the service, he sealed up the house with bars and locks. But he never came back. 18 months after he entered the service, in spring 1916, town authorities were notified that he had been killed in action. In June of that year, Hungarian soldiers came into Zinkota looking for gas supplies, and the constable directed them to the house where Kiss had lived. They broke into the house and found 7 gas drums in the attic, their weight supported by special framing. The soldiers took the drums outside and opened them up, only to recoil in horror. Instead of petrol, each of the drums was filled with the decomposing corpse of a nude female, stored in alcohol. Each had distinctive ligature marks on their neck, showing how they had left the world. Among the bodies were those of Marie and her lover, Paul. The police turned the house upside down, and they uncovered not only a great variety of female clothing and jewelry, but also innumerable pawn tickets for more valuables. They also found many letters from women who had responded to someone named Hoffman at a different address. Hoffman claimed to be a lonely widower looking for female companionship. And there were more than 7 bodies. As they searched the surrounding countryside, there was another shocker. 17 more drums, each packed with a nude female. Kiss had killed 23 females and 1 male in all. Police theorized that Kiss had killed Marie and Paul when he had discovered their affair, and that event had triggered his homicidal campaign to bilk widows out of their money and worldly goods. Afterward. After such a horrible discovery, everyone wanted justice. But Kiss was dead. Or was he? In spring 1919, Hoffman was reputedly sighted near the Margaret Bridge in Budapest. Police swarmed over the scene, then launched an investigation to determine whether Kiss was dead. The probe extended into Kiss's military service, and it was determined that he had been shipped to Serbia, where he was wounded and died in a military hospital. But investigators found that the Bila Kish who had died was a young man and looked nothing like the real Bila Kish. In 1932, the sharp-eyed New York City detective Henry Oswald, who had a reputation for remembering faces and was aware of the most wanted criminals in America and overseas, said he spotted Kish coming out of a New York City subway in Times Square. But before he could do anything, Kish disappeared into the crowd and was never seen again. Notable quotable: "We were so fond of him. He was kind to everyone. He wouldn't hurt a living thing. Once a dog had broken its leg. He made splints and nursed the animal to recovery. I am sure it is a mistake. He did not kill those women. Someone else did it." Bila Kish's housekeeper, defending him to police. Chapter 31. Ahmad Siraji, Indonesia. Notable fact: and then Siraji would break out an electrical cable and strangle them to death. Following this, he would drink their saliva, hoping to incorporate their power into himself. One night in 1986, a 36-year-old witch doctor named Ahmad Siraji went to bed and had a dream in which his deceased father appeared and gave him instructions on what he must do to increase and enhance his paranormal powers. In that moment, a lot of women in Indonesia were slated to die. His father had told him that to increase his supernatural powers, he had to kill 70 women. As a sorcerer, or witch doctor, Siraji had access to a lot of potential victims. In Indonesia, women and girls frequently visited sorcerers for advice and counsel and magical aid on romantic issues, particularly to cast spells to ensure that their spouses and husbands didn't cheat on them. Because the women were too embarrassed to tell their families of the visits, when they vanished, no one connected their disappearances to Siraji. His method of murder, both brutal and disgusting, was invariably the same. When visitors came to him, he would evaluate their spiritual needs and charge them the equivalent of $200 to $400. After he was paid, a woman would follow Siraji to a sugarcane field, where he claimed he had to bury them up to their waists in an already dug hole as part of the ritual. This incapacitated them, of course, and then Siraji would break out an electrical cable and strangle them to death. Following this, he would drink their saliva, hoping to incorporate their power into himself. Then he would strip them and rebury them with their heads facing his home so that their spirits would have a direct path to him. Sometimes, if paying customers were in short supply, Siraji would hire prostitutes to take part in the rituals that would end their lives. This was a very safe supply of victims because, as Ted Bundy had noted, prostitutes are low-risk targets because they often do not have much family to look for them if they go missing. Prostitutes would help Siraji meet his needed 70 victims that much faster. There is no way to know whether Siraji would have reached his goal, because on April 28, 1997, 11 years after his father had spoke to him in his dream, investigators looking for the many missing females discovered 3 women buried in the sugarcane field during a random search. Suspicion was cast Siraji's way. Police questioned him. They brutalized him, his wife said, and he admitted to murdering 16 females over a 5-year period. However, when the police searched his home, they found evidence indicating many more than 16 victims. They found clothing and personal items from 25 different females, the classic behavior not of a sorcerer, but of a serial murderer gathering trophies of his victims. Armed with this evidence, police were able to break down the sorcerer, and he admitted to killing 42 women and girls since his 1986 dream. The police also arrested his 3 wives, but after questioning, 2 of them were released. Only the oldest wife, Tumini, age 38 at the time, was charged. The trial of both Siraji and Tumini began on April 28, 1997. They were charged with 42 murders. The prosecution has its work cut out. The duo had taken back their confessions to police, claiming that police had beaten the admissions out of them. However, the jury didn't buy it. Both were found guilty. Tumini received a life sentence and Siraji a death sentence, an uncommonly harsh penalty in Indonesia. He was executed by firing squad in May 1998. After the trial, Siraji lamented to reporters that he would not reach his goal of 70 deaths. Chillingly, when the case hit the limelight, police asked all families in Indonesia to report to them whether anyone in their family was missing. About 80 families responded. Chapter 32. Yoshio Kodaira, Japan. Notable quotable. 4 or 5 comrades and I entered a Chinese home and locked him in the closet. We stole the jewelry and raped the women. We even bayoneted a pregnant woman and pulled out the fetus from her stomach. Yoshio Kodaira. Japan, even more than most countries, has a bloody history, rife with brutality and murder, and serial killers. But the one person who stands alone as the country's most active serial killer in the 20th century and beyond is Yoshio Kodaira. Kodaira was born in 1905. Although not a great deal is known about his childhood, at school he was combative, lazy, and uncaring. He frequently fought with his schoolmates, perhaps in part when other kids made fun of him because of his bad stutter, and he received poor grades on his schoolwork. Indeed, in his grammar school he was ranked near the bottom of the class and was lucky to graduate. Predictably, he didn't go to high school, instead becoming an apprentice in a metalworks factory. After leaving that job, Kodaira drifted aimlessly through a series of other low-paying, blue-collar jobs, and he also fathered a child. Unable to handle the responsibility of fatherhood, he took off, ending up, at age 18, in the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was a perfect opportunity for a budding serial killer. The Japanese armies were engaged in a brutal and sadistic war against mainland China in those days. Japanese soldiers raped and murdered Chinese citizens en masse. As Kodaira said of an assault on one family that he took part in, 4 or 5 comrades and I entered a Chinese home and locked him in the closet. We stole the jewelry and raped the women. We even bayoneted a pregnant woman and pulled out the fetus from her stomach. I also engaged in those depraved actions. While aware that the actions were depraved, at least on an intellectual level, the experience surely didn't stop Kodaira from continuing his life in the same vein. Killer on the loose. When he left the Navy in 1932, after a 9-year stint, he charmed a young woman into marrying him, much to the displeasure of the woman's family, and particularly her father, a Shinto priest. As the family and father predicted, the marriage was hardly made in heaven, and one day it climaxed in a physical fight between Kodaira and his in-laws. The result was that Kodaira killed his bride's father with an iron bar and injured half a dozen other relatives. He was arrested and tried for these crimes and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But when World War II started, Kodaira and other prisoners were given amnesty so they could aid in the war effort. Kodaira, because of his Navy experience, was given a job as a civilian at a Navy facility where young women worked under him, something like allowing the fox to guard the henhouse. Kodaira became a peeping Tom, spying on the young women as they bathed after work. Eventually, he started to murder them. His homicidal activities were hardly noticed because Japanese authorities were too busy trying to defend against Allied air attacks. His first discovered murder was on May 25, 1945. The victim was 19-year-old Miyazaki Mitsuko, whom he had raped and strangled. He hid her corpse behind an air raid shelter. During the rest of the year, even after Japan surrendered to the Allies in August, he killed 6 more women, ranging in age from 19 to 32 at the Navy facility, finishing out 1945 with the murder of 19-year-old Baba Hiroko on December 30th. Post-war murders. After 1945, Kodaira took a 6-month break from killing, then started in again by raping and strangling a 15-year-old girl. Of course, his wartime service was over, and with it the ever-ready supply of employees as victims. His compulsions demanded a fresh supply, and he devised a way to get them. At the time, post-war Japan was rife with black market activity, much of it in Tokyo. He simply trolled the area where the illegal activities took place and waited for a likely victim to come along, with the reasoning that, if the girl was involved in the black market, she wasn't likely to be missed if she disappeared. In early July 1946, Kodaira met 17-year-old Midorikawa Ryuko. They seemed to have something of a relationship going. He even visited her parents. But by early August, Midorikawa had vanished, and so had Kodaira. Around the same time, another young woman, Shinokawa Tatsue, had also disappeared. Tatsue was found murdered near Zojoji Temple in Tokyo, and the Ryuko girl was found in the temple itself. Police investigated, and Tatsue's parents told police they had last seen their daughter when she went to see a man for a job interview. The name of the man? Yoshio Kodaira. Police tracked Kodaira down, and he spoke with them freely, admitting not only the murder of the two recent females but also all of the others, as well as 30 rapes. Kodaira seemed to have no interest in living, and on October 5, 1949, Japanese authorities obliged him. He was hanged. Chapter 33. Arnfinn Nesset, Norway. Notable quotable. I've killed so many, I'm unable to remember them all. Arnfinn Nesset. A scary and surprising number of serial killers work in hospitals. The reason is twofold. Some serial murderers gravitate towards hospitals because of their ready supply of potential victims. But even more than this, dramatic methods like shooting or strangling don't have to be used in hospitals. Indeed, medical serial killers can kill patients, usually fragile and weak, in a variety of ways, including poisoning, suffocating, disconnecting machines, inducing overdoses of medication, or even drowning. Medical serial killers have been doctors, nurses, and aides. They have been male and female, black and white. Such killers are more common than anyone would like to think. Purported motives vary, at least on the surface. For example, some medical serial killers try to play hero, administering a drug to induce a crisis, such as cardiac arrest, and then saving the person. However, sometimes the patient dies. Others kill under the guise of mercy, or for profit, and some are likely just plain sadistic. Many of them never get caught, but occasionally one does when the sheer number of dead patients triggers an investigation, or when there's a small glitch or abnormality that drives people to start looking beneath the surface. So it was with Arnfinn Nesset, a mild-looking, balding, bespectacled man in his 40s who was the most prolific medical serial killer in Norway's history. The Hospital Manager. As it happened, in early 1981, someone noticed that Nesset, hospital manager of the Orkdale Valley Nursing Home, had ordered a large amount of curacet, a derivative of curare, a lethal poison that South American Indians put on the tips of their arrows. If administered in a large dose to a person, curacet interferes with respiration and causes death by suffocation. However, it breaks down in a person's system and is very difficult to detect as a cause of death. Orkdale Valley had had a very high death rate among its residents since it had opened in 1977. Maybe the poison and the death rate were related? The police were contacted, and they interviewed Nesset, who claimed he bought the poison to put down a dog that, given the amount of curacet, would have had to have been the size of an elephant. On March 9, 1981, 46-year-old Nesset was arrested for murder. He was eventually charged with the murder of 25 people, 11 women and 14 men. The victims' ages ranged from 67 to 94, and all had died between 1977 and 1980, the exact time frame that Nesset had worked there. Nesset denied culpability at first, but then admitted that he had indeed ended the lives of the patients. At one point, he said, "I've killed so many, I'm unable to remember them all." Afterward. After Nesset's confession to the Orkdale Valley murders, police probed deaths at 3 other facilities where he had worked since 1962, and eventually determined that he had likely killed at least 62 patients. But proving it, because of the way the body breaks down the poison, was difficult, if not impossible, so police did not pursue indictments on many of the deaths. Before his trial started in October 1982, Nesset had a surprise for prosecutors. He withdrew his confessions and pleaded innocent, using a basic defense of euthanasia. He claimed he had killed the people to put them out of their misery. Prosecutors battled this by saying that the murders had nothing to do with mercy killing, a position that was easily proved, as Nesset had embezzled some $1,800 from the people he killed. The defense countered that Nesset had donated all the money to charity, but it wasn't enough. On March 11, 1983, he was found guilty of 22 murders and assorted embezzlement charges. Shockingly, at least for Americans, he was sentenced to only 21 years in jail, the maximum allowed under Norwegian law. But there was also the possibility of being sentenced for an additional 10 years of preventative detention. Who am I? 1. I was born in Nottingham, England, in January 1946 to a working-class family. I am the most prolific serial murderer Europe has ever seen. 2. I was nothing special intellectually, but my mother's favoritism of me spurred me on to become a doctor. 3. I married a very average woman named Primrose Oxtoby when she became pregnant with my child. 4. I was caught giving myself injections for depression and was fired from my job in a hospital. In 1977, I moved to Hyde, Cheshire, and opened a practice. It was there that I started to murder people with medication. 5. I was an arrogant man who thought nothing of reducing employees and sometimes patients to tears. For example, I once criticized the breasts of one young girl, and she ran from the room in tears. 6. I had a quick, white-hot temper. Screw up my morning coffee, and I would rip you apart. 7. My killing specialty was older people. I mocked my victims and used derogatory codes for them, such as WOW, whining old woman, and FTPBI, failed to put brain in. 8. I scammed money from patients who died, including £300,000 from one elderly patient, Mrs. Grundy, who died suddenly on June 24, 1998. I came under suspicion for her death, and my colleague, Dr. Linda Reynolds, noted the unusually high death rate among my patients and notified a coroner. 9. Investigation disclosed that I had killed innumerable elderly patients with a morphine overdose. I was arrested and tried for killing 15 patients, found guilty, and given 15 life sentences. 10. I hanged myself in my jail cell on January 13, 2004. Authorities later determined that I had murdered up to 260 people over a 23-year period. Answer: I am Dr. Harold Shipman. Chapter 34. Karl Denke, Poland. Notable fact: many people who stayed at Papa's rooming house went in, but never came out. Not much is known about Karl Denke, probably the worst serial killer in Poland's history. After he was exposed as a killer, he committed suicide, taking his secrets with him. What is known, however, is right up there with the worst of the worst. Denke owned and operated a rooming house in Zębica, Poland, from 1918 to 1924. He was well liked by his tenants and known as Papa. Like a number of other serial murderers, such as the BTK Killer, Papa was active in his local church. He played the organ. However, there was a problem. Many people who stayed at Papa's rooming house went in but never came out. On December 21, 1924, a coachman heard someone screaming inside an apartment in Denke's rooming house. The coachman ran to the apartment, and a young man was staggering down the hall toward him, holding his head, which was streaming blood. The coachman ran up to the man, who collapsed, but before he lost consciousness, he blurted out that Papa Denke had attacked him with an axe. The coachman summoned the police, who arrested Denke and searched his house, a search that turned up some shocking things. They found ID for a dozen salesmen, as well as ties, shirts, pants, and hats in different sizes and styles, which obviously did not all belong to Papa Denke. In a ledger of Denke's, they found what might at first seem like curious but harmless information: names, dates, and weights of his visitors. But the ledger made horrific sense when combined with some of the other discoveries. 2 large tubs in the kitchen filled with pickled meat, a large pot containing fat, and bones, all human. They were able to figure out that 31 human beings had been murdered between 1921 and 1924 and were in the process of being eaten. While many of Papa Denke's victims were salespeople, he also preyed on tramps and beggars, anyone who wouldn't really be missed or easily linked to Papa Denke. Perhaps worst of all, not only was Denke a cannibal, but also chances are that he was feeding parts of murdered people to his lodgers. We'll never know for sure. Papa Denke wore suspenders to hold up his pants, and he used them one final time to hang himself in his prison cell before police could get any information from him. Chapter 35. Andrei Chikatilo, Russia. Notable quotable. What I did was not for sexual pleasure. Rather, it brought me some peace of mind. Andrei Chikatilo. In late December 1978, the body of a 9-year-old girl was discovered in the Grushevka River in the town of Shakhty, Russia. She had been raped, strangled, and stabbed repeatedly in the face. The 25-year-old suspect, Alexander Kravchenko, was arrested. He had a pedigree for the crime, having served time in prison for rape and murder. The Russian police beat a confession out of Kravchenko. He was charged with a little girl's murder, tried, found guilty, and executed by firing squad. The only problem was that Kravchenko was innocent, and in 1981, the bodies of boys, girls, and young women started showing up in and around the woods of Rostov-on-Don, near Shakhty, where the first body was found. Despite the victims' differences in age and gender, it was clearly the work of the same killer. The bodies were all mutilated in various ways. Some had nipples excised, tongues cut out, noses cut off, genitalia removed, or had been disemboweled, and almost all were stabbed repeatedly in the face. A madman was on the loose. As each new body was discovered, anxiety ratcheted up for both the public and the police, even though, according to the communist regime of the time, there was no Russian serial killer. The ruling party claimed that killers like the one operating around Rostov were only a part of decadent Western regimes, not Russia's enlightened system. Indeed, the official government attitude hampered the police investigation because they were forbidden to put out wanted circulars on him or even admit he existed. But the police knew that the killer who came to be known as the Rostov Ripper was very real, and so did much of the public. The Rostov Ripper. In August 1984, 8 corpses bearing the handiwork of the Rostov Ripper were found. Right around this time, police interviewed the real killer for the second time. They had talked to him after the little girl's murder in 1978, but had let him go. The man, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, hardly seemed a homicidal maniac. He was a rather bland-looking individual, married, and held a university degree. However, he was hardly ready for sainthood. He had been employed in the late 1970s as a school dormitory supervisor and had been terminated because of allegations that he molested some male students. After losing that job, Chikatilo worked as a supply clerk, overseeing locomotive products in Rostov-on-Don. This proved to be the perfect job for a homicidal maniac. He was required to make frequent trips by bus or rail, meaning he frequently shared railroad stations and bus terminals with all kinds of people, including the young women and children of both sexes whom he liked to murder and mutilate. Chikatilo's 1984 interview with the police, however, did not lead anywhere, particularly since his innocence was trumpeted by the local Communist Party, of which he was a member, who declared that a man of such fine political character could not possibly also be a murderer. Chikatilo was released to kill again. And kill he did, remaining undetected despite a massive police effort that ultimately resulted in interrogations of some 25,000 suspects between 1981 and 2000. Sticks and Stones. Andrei Chikatilo, or the Rostov Ripper, was also described as the Mad Beast and Mistake of Nature. The Monster's Mistake. In early November 1990, a policeman spotted Chikatilo in a Rostov railway station and noticed that he had blood on his hands and face. While Chikatilo was not detained, the policeman did make a mental note of this man, covered in blood. 2 weeks after the policeman saw Chikatilo covered in blood, a body was discovered near that same railway station. Police brought Chikatilo in for questioning, which turned into a marathon 8-day grilling, at the end of which Chikatilo confessed. Like a poisonous snake uncoiling, Chikatilo detailed how he would stalk railway stations and bus depots until he spotted a likely victim, usually a child or young person waiting for a train or bus alone. He would offer them a ride, or perhaps something to eat, then lead them into the woods, where he would abruptly spring on the person, overpowering and killing them, and then mutilating them as his bloodlust dictated. Chikatilo confessed to 55 murders and was charged with 53. His trial started on April 14, 1992, in a plain courtroom. The then 54-year-old Chikatilo stood in the dock like all prisoners, but he was enclosed in a large iron cage that had been constructed over the dock to protect him from parents and other angry people. The scene was chaotic, with the families of his murder victims shrieking and baying for his blood. Unusually, Chikatilo chose to testify in front of all these people, in part to attempt an explanation of why and how he had turned into the Rostov Ripper. Chikatilo testified that he was born in the Ukraine on October 16, 1936, and that he and his family had been victims of the poverty and hunger triggered by Joseph Stalin's collectivism of Russian farms in the 1930s. Many people in his area starved. Indeed, Chikatilo believed that neighbors had cannibalized an older brother of his, and this had been seared into his young soul. There is no proof readily available to confirm that the neighbors ate his brother, but his mother constantly told him it was so, and Chikatilo came to believe it. Chikatilo believed that his mother and the fate of his brother were a large part of why he killed. However, childhood trauma was not enough to get him off the hook for so much death, and Chikatilo was found guilty of 53 counts of murder on October 15, 1992, and sentenced to death. Less than 2 years later, following a rejected appeal for clemency from President Boris Yeltsin, the sentence was carried out, and an executioner fired a single round into the back of Chikatilo's head. Fatal Flaws. Appearing in public with blood on your hands and face is hardly the kind of thing that will go unnoticed, but it is often the kind of sloppy mistake that ultimately leads to the capture of serial killers. Ted Bundy, when wanted for murder, drove a car at night in Florida without a taillight and was pulled over. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, carelessly got a parking ticket that led to his capture. Dennis Rader communicated with police via computer, trusting them after he asked whether they could track him electronically. It's easy to wonder if these are just careless mistakes, or if some part of these serial killers wants to be stopped. Chapter 36. Moses Sithole, South Africa. Notable quotable. "I force a woman to go where I want," he said, "and when I go there I tell them, 'Do you know what? I was hurt, so I'm doing it now. Then I kill them.'" Moses Sithole. Moses Sithole is hands down the worst serial murderer in South African history. Astonishingly, Sithole, when tried, was found guilty of 38 murders between January and October 1995, 38 murders in just 10 months, or about 4 killings a month. That's bloodlust. Sithole was good-looking and charming, and very bold. He would approach women in broad daylight and somehow lure them into surrounding isolated fields, where he would launch his attack, which included stripping, beating, raping, and then strangling them with their own clothing. Sometimes he would tie them up. Many times he would cover their faces with an article of clothing, symbolically, if not actually, preventing them from seeing him. The killings had happened so fast and were so vicious that the entire country was in a state of alarm, including President Nelson Mandela, who actually canceled an important political trip to plead for the public's help in tracking the killer down. So desperate were South African authorities to solve the crimes, dubbed the ABC murders by the press, as they had started in Attridgeville, moved to Boksburg, then continued in Cleveland, that they brought in 2 renowned profilers to work the case, the premier South African profiler Mickey Pistorius and the famed FBI agent Robert Ressler. Their collaboration didn't result in the capture of the killer, but Ressler provided one helpful insight. He was the first to connect the murders in the 3 towns to one killer. The killer slips. In October 1995, his 38 killings all behind him, the killer contacted Cape Town's Star newspaper and claimed to be the ABC murderer. During the call, which Star recorded, he made a series of complaints that contained specific information. For example, he had been convicted of a rape in 1978 that he said he didn't do, but as a result, he spent 14 years in prison. He also said he had to endure the death of his parents and sister while he was behind bars. He said this experience built up a terrible need for revenge in him, and he took it out on women. "I force a woman to go where I want," he said, "and when I go there, I tell them, 'Do you know what? I was hurt, so I'm doing it now.' Then I kill them." The Star reporter talking to him asked just how many women he had killed, and he had a stunning answer: 76. This was twice as many victims as police had thought. To prove he was the killer, he finished the call with directions to the body of one of his victims. Thankfully, however, the caller had provided more than enough personal information for police to identify him as Moses Sithole. Police soon focused on him and ultimately arrested him. When the police located him, Sithole went at them with a hatchet, but he was shot and neutralized. In the hospital, it was learned that he was HIV positive. He went on trial in February 1997, charged with 38 murders, 40 rapes, and 6 counts of robbery. On December 5, 1997, he was found guilty and sentenced to 2,410 years. It was thought that he would die within 7 or 8 years of his trial from HIV-related complications, but he is still alive and in prison. Part 4. In Their Own Words. There is nothing quite as horrific as confessions straight from the mouths of serial killers. Following are the words of BTK Killer Dennis Rader, describing how he killed people, including an entire family. There is also the description of Edmund Kemper's attack on 2 young women one sunny day in California, and a few choice words from Green River Killer Gary Ridgway. Chapter 37. Dennis Rader. Court transcript of his confession. Murder of the Otero family. Defendant, on January 15, 1974, said, "I maliciously, intentionally, and with premeditation killed Joseph Otero. Count 2. Court. All right, Mr. Rader, I need to find out more information. On that particular day, the 15th day of January, 1974, can you tell me where you went to kill Mr. Joseph Otero?" Defendant. I think it's 1834 Edgemore. Court. All right. Can you tell me approximately what time of day you went there? Defendant. Somewhere between 7 and 7:30. Court. This particular location, did you know these people? Defendant. No, that's off-the-record discussion between the defendant and Ms. McKinnon, his lawyer. No, that was part of my what you call fantasy. These people were selected. Court. All right. So you... Off-the-record discussion between the defendant and Ms. McKinnon. Court. You were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time? Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. All right. Now, where you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure? Defendant. Sexual fantasy, sir? Court. I see. So, you went to this residence, and what occurred then? Defendant. Well, did some thinking on what I was going to do to either Mrs. Otero or Josephine, and basically broke into the house, or didn't break into the house, but when they came out of the house, I came in and confronted the family, and then we went from there. Court. All right. Had you planned this beforehand? Defendant. To some degree, yes. After I got in the house, it lost control of it, but it was, in the back of my mind, I had some ideas what I was going to do. Court. Did you... Defendant. But I basically panicked that first day, so... Court. Beforehand, did you know who was there in the house? Defendant. I thought Mrs. Otero and the two younger kids were in the house. I didn't realize Mr. Otero was going to be there. Court. All right. How did you get into the house, Mr. Rader? Defendant. I came through the back door, cut the phone lines, waited at the back door, had reservations about even going or just walking away, but pretty soon the door opened, and I was in. Court. All right. So the door opened. Was it opened for you, or did someone... Defendant. I think one of the kids, the young girl, Joseph, opened the door. He probably let the dog out, 'cause the dog was in the house at the time. Court. All right. When you went into the house, what happened then? Defendant. Well, I confronted the family, pulled the pistol, confronted Mr. Otero, and asked him to, that I was there to... Basically, I was wanted to get the car. I was hungry, food, I was wanted, and asked him to lie down in the living room. And at that time I realized that wouldn't be a really good idea, so the dog was the real problem, so I asked Mr. Otero if he could get the dog out. So he had one of the kids put it out, and then I took them back to the bedroom. Court. You took who back to the bedroom? Defendant. The family, the bedroom, the 4 members. Court. All right. What happened then? Defendant. At that time, I tied them up. Court. While still holding them at gunpoint? Defendant. Well, in between tying, I guess, Court. All right. After you tied them up, what occurred? Defendant. Well, they started complaining about being tied up, and I re-loosened the bonds a couple of times, tried to make Mr. Otero as comfortable as I could. Apparently, he had a cracked rib from a car accident, so I had him put a pillow down on for his head, had him put a parka or a coat underneath him. They talked to me about, giving me the car or whatever money. I guess they didn't have very much money, and from there I realized that, I didn't have a mask on or anything. They already could ID me, and made a decision to go ahead and put him down, I guess, or strangle him. Court. All right. What did you do to Joseph Otero, Sr.? Defendant. Joseph Otero? Court. Yes, Joseph Otero, Sr., Mr. Otero, the father. Defendant. Put a plastic bag over his head, and then some cords and tightened it. Court. This was in the bedroom. Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. All right. Did he in fact suffocate and die as a result of this? Defendant. Not right away. No, sir, he didn't. Court. What happened? Defendant. Well, after that I did Mrs. Otero. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take, but... Court. Was she also tied up there in the bedroom? Defendant. Yes, Yeah, both their hands and their feet were tied up. She was on the bed. Court. Where were the children? Defendant. Well, Josephine was on the bed, and Junior was on the floor. Court. All right. Defendant. At this time. Court. So we're talking first of all about Joseph Otero. So, you had put the bag over his head and tied it. Defendant. I don't know. I have no idea. Just... Court. What happened then? Defendant. I got the keys to the car. In fact, I had the keys, I think, earlier, before that, because I wanted to make sure I had a way of getting out of the house, and cleaned the house up a little bit, made sure everything's packed up, and left through the front door, and then went over to their car, and drove to Dillon's, left the car there, then eventually walked back to my car. Court. All right. Now, sir, from what you have just said, I take it that the facts you have told me apply to both counts 1, all of counts 1, 2, 3, and 4. Is that correct? Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. Now, Mr. Rader, and he did not die right away. Can you tell me what happened in regards to Joseph Otero? Defendant. He moved over real quick, and I think he tore a hole in the bag, and I could tell that he was having some problems there, but at the time the whole family just went panicked on me, so I worked pretty quick. I got Mrs. Court. All right. What did you worked pretty quick. What did you do? Defendant. Well, I strangled Mrs. Otero, and then she passed out. I thought she was dead. She passed out. Then I strangled Josephine. She passed out, or I thought she was dead. And then I went over and put a bag on Junior's head, and then, if I remember right, Mrs. Otero came back. She came back, and... Court. Sir, let me ask you about Joseph Otero, Sr. Defendant. Sr. Court. You indicated he had torn a hole in the bag. Defendant. Mm-hmm. Court. What did you do with him then? Defendant. I put another bag over it, or either that or if I recollect, I think I put either a cloth or a t-shirt or something over it, over his head, and then another bag, then tied that down. Court. Did he subsequently die? Defendant. Well, yes. I didn't just stay there and watch him. I was moving around the room, but... Court. All right, so you indicated you strangled Mrs. Otero after you had done this. Is that correct? Defendant. Yeah, I went back and strangled her again. Court. All right. Defendant. And that finally killed her at that time. The murder of Catherine Bright. Court. All right, Mr. Rader, we will now turn to count 5. In that count it is claimed that on or about the 4th day of April 1974 in Sedgwick County, Kansas, that you unlawfully killed Catherine Bright, maliciously, willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation, by strangulation and stabbing, inflicting injuries from which she did die on April 4th, 1974. Can you tell me what happened on that day? Off-the-record discussions between Mr. Osborne and the defendant. Defendant. Well, I don't know how to exactly say that. I had many, what I called them, projects. There were different people in town that I followed, watched, Catherine Bright was one of the next targets, I guess, as I would indicate. Court. How did you select her? Defendant. Just by driving by one day, when I saw her go in the house with somebody else, and I thought, that's a possibility. There was many places in the area, College Hill even. They're all over Wichita. But anyway, it just was basically a selection process, worked toward it. If it didn't work, I'd just move on to something else. But in the my kind of person, stalking and strolling, you go through the trolling stage and then a stalking stage. She was in the stalking stage when this happened. Court. All right, sir. So, you identified Catherine Bright as a potential victim. Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. What did you do here in Sedgwick County, then? Defendant. Pardon? Court. What did you do, then, here in Sedgwick County? Defendant. On this particular day? Court. Yes. Defendant. I broke into the house and waited for her to come home. Court. How did you break into the house? Defendant. Through the back door, on the east side. Court. All right, and you waited for her to come home. Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. Where did you wait? Defendant. In the house there, probably close to the bedroom. I walked through the house and kind of figured out where I'd be if they came through. Court. All right, what happened then? Defendant. She and Kevin Bright came in. I wasn't expecting him to be there, and come to find out, I guess they were related. That time I approached them and told them I was wanted in California, needed some car. Basically the same thing I told the Oteros. Kind of eased them, make them feel better, and proceeded to, I think I had him tie her up first, and then I tied him up, or vice versa. I don't remember right now at that time. Court. Let me ask. Defendant. Court. You indicated that you had some items to tie these people with. Did you bring these items, both the Oteros, into this location? Defendant. The Oteros I did. I'm not really sure on the Brights. There were some... In working with the police, there was some controversy on that. Probably more likely I did, but if I had brought my stuff and used my stuff, Kevin would probably be dead today. Court. All right. Defendant. I'm not bragging on that. It's just a matter of fact. It's the bond had Tauro tied him up with that. He broke them so that... Court. All right, sir. Defendant. It may be same with Catherine. It was... They got out of hand. Court. All right. Now, you indicated you believe you had Kevin tie Catherine up. Defendant. Court. Tell me what happened then. Defendant. Okay. I moved, after... I really can't remember, Judge, whether I had her tie him up or she tied him up, but anyway, I moved her to another bedroom, and he is already secure there by the bed. Tied his feet to the bedpost, one of the bedposts, so that he couldn't run. Kind of tired her in the other bedroom, and then I came back to strangle him, and at that time we had a fight. Court. You were armed with a handgun at that time also? Defendant. Yes, I had a handgun. Court. All right. What happened when you came back? Defendant. I actually had 2 handguns. Court. All right. Defendant. Well, when I started strangling, either the garrote broke or he broke his bonds, and he jumped up real quick like. I pulled my gun and quickly shot him. I hit him in the head. He fell over. I could see the blood. And as far as I was concerned, I thought he was down and was out, and then went and started to strangle Catherine. And then we started fighting because the bonds weren't very good, and so back and forth we fought. Court. You and Catherine? Defendant. Yeah, we fought. Uh-huh. And I got the best of her, and I thought she was going down, and then I could hear some movement in the other room. So I went back, and Kevin— No, I thought she was going down, and I went back to the other bedroom where Kevin was at, and I tried to re-strangle him at that time, and he jumped up and we fought, and he about shot me, 'cause he got the other pistol that was in my shoulder here. I had my Magnum in my shoulder, so— and really— Court. A shoulder holster? Defendant. Court. Did you have it in a shoulder holster? Defendant. Yes, I had the Magnum in my shoulder holster. The other one was a .22. Court. All right. Defendant. And we fought at that point in time, and I thought it was gonna go off. I jammed the gun, stuck my finger in there, jammed it, and I think he thought that was the only gun I had, 'cause once I either bit his finger or hit him or something, got away, and I used the .22 and shot him one more time, and I thought he was down for good that time. Court. All right. So, you shot him a second time. Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. Went back to finish the job on Catherine, and she was fighting, and at that point in time I'd been fighting her. And then I heard I don't know whether I was basically losing control. The strangulation wasn't working on her, and I used a knife on her. You say you used a knife on her? Defendant. Yes. Court. What did you do with the knife? Defendant. I stabbed her. She was either stabbed 2 or 3 times, either here or here, maybe 2 back here and 1 here, or maybe just 2 times back here. Court. And you're pointing to your lower back and your Defendant. Yeah, underneath the ribs. Court. And your lower abdomen. Defendant. Yeah, underneath the ribs, up under the ribs. Court. So after you stabbed her, what happened? Defendant. Actually, I think at that point in time, well, it's a total mess, 'cause I didn't have control on it. She was bleeding. She went down. I think I just went back to check on Kevin, or at that basically same time I heard him escape. It could be one of the two, but all of a sudden the front door of the house was open and he was gone, and, oh, I tell you what I thought. I thought the police were coming at that time. I heard the door open. I thought, that's it, and stepped out there, and I could see him running down the street. So I quickly cleaned up everything that I could and left. Court. All right. Now, Mr. Rader, you indicated that at the Oteros you did not have a mask on. Did you have a mask on at the Brights? Defendant. No, I didn't. Huh. Court. All right. So what happened then? Defendant. I tried. I had already had the keys to the cars, and I thought I had the right key to the right car. I ran out to their car, I think it was a pickup out there, and I tried it. Didn't work, and at that point in time he was gone, running down the street. I thought, well, I'm in trouble, so I tried it. It didn't work. So I took off, ran. I went east, and then worked back toward the Wichita State University campus where my car was parked. Court. All right. So you had parked your car at the Wichita State University. Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. Campus? Defendant. The campus. Court. How far away was the Brights' residence? Defendant. Oh, I parked, 13th? And I parked by that park, and then I walked to 13th, to the Brights' residence, so I basically ran back. Court. All right. So you were able to get to your car and get away. Defendant. Yes, sir. The murder of Shirley Vian. Court. Now let's turn to count 6. In that count, they claimed on March 17, 1977, in Sedgwick County, Kansas, that you unlawfully killed Shirley Vian, maliciously, willfully, deliberately and with premeditation, by strangulation, inflicting injuries from which she did die on March 17, 1977. Can you tell me what you did on that day? Defendant: As before, Vian was, actually on that one she was completely random. There was actually someone that, across from Dylan's, was potential target. I had project numbers assigned to it. And that particular day I drove to Dylan's, parked in the parking lot, watched this particular residence, and then got out of the car and walked over to it. It's probably in the police report, the address. I don't remember the address now. Knocked. Nobody answered it. So I was all keyed up, so I just started going through the neighborhood. I had been through the neighborhood before. I knew a little of the layout of the neighborhood. I'd been through the back alleys, knew where some certain people lived. While I was walking down Hydraulic, I met a young boy and asked him if he would ID some pictures, kind of as a ruse, I guess, or ruse, as you call it, and kind of feel it out, and saw where he went, and I went to another address, knocked on the door. Nobody opened the door, so I just noticed where he went and went to that house, and we went from there. Court: Now, you call these projects. Were these sexual fantasies also? Defendant: Potential hits. That, in my world, that's what I called them. Court: All right. So you, Defendant: They were called projects, hits. Court: All right. And why did you have these potential hits? Was this to gratify some sexual interest, or... Defendant: Yes, sir. I had a lot of them, so it's just, if one didn't work, I just moved to another one. Court: All right. So, as I am to understand it, then, on March 17th, 1977, you saw this little boy go into a residence. Defendant: Mm-hmm. Court: And you tried another residence? Defendant: Sir? Court: No one was there? You tried another residence. No one was there, so you... Defendant: Right. Yeah. Court: Went to the residence with the little boy. Defendant: And I watched where he went. Court: What happened then? Defendant: After I tried this once, the residence, nobody came to the door. I went to this house where he went in, knocked on the door and told him I was a private detective, showed him a picture that I had just showed the boy, and asked him if they could ID the picture, and that time I had the gun here, and I just kind of forced myself in. I just, walked in, just opened the door and walked in, and then pulled a pistol. Court: What happened then? Defendant: I told Miss Vian that I had a problem with sexual fantasies, that I was going to tie her up, and that I might have to tie the kids up, and that she would cooperate with me at that time. We went back. She was extremely nervous. Think she even smoked a cigarette. And we went back to one of the back areas of the porch, explained to her that I had done this before, and, I think at that point in time, I think she was sick, because she had a night robe on, and I think, if I remember right, she had been sick. I think she came out of the bedroom when I went in the house. So anyway, we went back to her bedroom, and I proceeded to tie the kids up, and they started crying and got real upset. So I said, "Oh, this is not going to work." So we moved them to the bathroom. She helped me, and then I tied the door shut. We put some toys and blankets and odds and ends in there for the kids, make them as comfortable as we could. We tied one of the bathroom doors shut so they couldn't open it, and she went back and helped me shove the bed up against the other bathroom door, and then I proceeded to tie her up. She got sick, threw up, got her a glass of water, comforted her a little bit, and then went ahead and tied her up and then got a bag over her head and strangled her. Court: All right. Was this a plastic bag also? Defendant: Yes, sir. I think it was. Court: All right. Defendant: but I could be wrong in that. Court. You put a bag, or... Defendant. It was something. I'm sure it was a plastic bag, yeah. Court. Now, you say you put a bag over her head and strangled her. What did you strangle her with? Defendant. I think on that I had tied her legs to the bedposts and worked up with the rope all the way up, and then what I had left over I looped over her neck. Court. All right. So you used this rope to strangle her. Defendant. Yes, I think it was the same one that I tied her body with. Court. All right. What happened then? Defendant. Well, the kids were really banging on the door, hollering and screaming, and then the telephone rang, and they had talked earlier that the neighbor's going to check on 'em, so I cleaned everything up real quick like, and got out of there, left and went back in to my car. Court. Now, when you say you cleaned everything... Defendant. Well, I mean, put my stuff... I had a briefcase. Whatever I have lying around, ropes, tape, cords, I threw that in there. My, whatever, that I had brought in the house. Court. Had you brought that to the Bright residence also, or... Defendant. Yeah, there is some... I think there's some basic stuff, but I don't remember bringing total stuff like I did to some of the others. Court. Was this a kit that you had prepared? Defendant. Yeah, Court. Beforehand? Defendant. Yes, I call it my hit kit. Court. All right, sir. You left the Vian residence, and you had parked your vehicle near there? Defendant. Yeah, still in the same parking lot there at Dillon's. Court. All right. Defendant. At Hydraulic and... what is that, Harry? Lincoln, yeah. Lincoln and Hydraulic. The murder of Nancy Fox. Court. All right. In Count 7, it is claimed that on the 8th day of December, 1977, in Sedgwick County, Kansas, that you unlawfully killed a human being, that being Nancy Fox, maliciously, willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation, by strangulation, inflicting injuries from which the said Nancy Fox did die on December 8th, 1977. Can you tell me what you did on that day here in Sedgwick County? Defendant. Nancy Fox was another one of the projects. When I was trolling the area, I noticed her go in the house one night. Sometimes I would... Then anyway, I put her down as potential victim. Court. Let me ask you one thing, Mr. Rader. You've used that term when you were patrolling the area. What do you mean by that? Defendant. It's called stalking, or trolling. Court. So you were not working in any form or fashion. You were just... Defendant. Well, I don't know, if you read much about serial killers, they go through what they call the different phases. That's one of the phases they go through as a trolling stage. Basically, you're looking for a victim at that time, and that can either be trolling for months or years. But once you lock in on a certain person, then you become stalking, and that might be several of them, but you really hone in on that person. They basically come to, that's the victim, or at least that's what you want them to be. Court. All right, sir. Defendant. No, I wasn't working, sir. Court. All right. Defendant. No, this was off my hours. Court. All right. So you basically identified Nancy Fox as one of your projects. What happened then? Defendant. At first she was spotted, and then I did a little homework. I dropped by once to check the mailbox to see what her name was, found out where she worked, stopped by there once at Heltzberg, kind of sized her up. The more I know about a person, the more I felt comfortable with it, so I did that a couple of times. And then I just selected a night, which was this particular night, to try it. And it worked out. Court. All right. Can you tell me what you did on the night of December 8th, 1977? Defendant: About 2 or 3 blocks away, I parked my car and walked to that residence. I knocked at the door first to make sure, see if anybody was in there, 'cause I knew she arrived home at a particular time from where she worked. Nobody answered the door, so I went around to the back of the house, cut the phone lines. I could tell that there wasn't anybody in the north apartment. Broke in and waited for her to come home in the kitchen. Court: All right. Did she come home? Defendant: Yes, she did. Court: What happened? Defendant: I confronted her, told her I had a problem, sexual problem, that I would have to tie her up and have sex with her. Court: Defendant: She was a little upset. We talked for a while. She smoked a cigarette. While we smoked a cigarette, I went through her purse, identifying some stuff, and she finally said, "Well, let's get this over with so I can go call the police." I said, "Yes." She went to the bathroom and came, and I told her when she came out to make sure that she was undressed. And when she came out, I handcuffed her, and don't really remember whether I... Court: You handcuffed her? Defendant: Sir? Court: You handcuffed her. You had a pair of handcuffs? Defendant: Yes, sir. Court: What happened then? Defendant: Well, anyway, I had her. I handcuffed her, had her lay on the bed, and then I tied her feet, and then I was also undressed to a certain degree, and then I got on top of her, and then reached over, took either her feet were tied or not tied, but anyway, I think I had a belt. I took the belt, and then strangled her with the belt at that time. Court: All right. After you had strangled her, what happened then? Defendant: Okay, after I strangled her with the belt, I took the belt off and retied that with pantyhose real tight, removed the handcuffs and tied those with pantyhose. Can't remember the colors right now. I think I maybe retied her feet, if they hadn't already. They were probably already tied, her feet were, and then at that time masturbated, sir. Court: All right. Had you had sexual relations with her? Defendant: No. Court: Before? Defendant: No, I told her I was, but I did not. Court: All right. So you masturbated. Then what did you do? Defendant: Dressed and then went through the house, took some personal items, and kind of cleaned the house up, went through and checked everything, and then left. Court: All right. The murder of Marine Hedge. Court: All right, sir. Let's turn to Count 8. In Count 8, it is claimed that on or about the 27th day of April, 1985, to the 28th day of April, 1985, in Sedgwick County, Kansas, it is claimed that you unlawfully killed a human being, Marine Hedge, maliciously, willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation, by strangulation, inflicting injuries from which Marine Hedge did die on April 27th, 1985. Can you tell me what occurred on that day? Defendant: Well, actually, kind of like the others. She was chosen. I went through the different phases, stalking phase, and since she lived down the street from me, I could watch the coming and going quite easily. On that particular date, I had other commitment. I came back from that commitment, parked my car over at Woodlawn and 21st Street at a bowling alley there at the time. Before that, I had some other clothes on. I changed clothes. I went to the bowling alley, went in there under the pretense of bowling, called a taxi. Had a taxi take me out to Park City. Had my kit with me. It was a bowling bag. Court: All right. Now, is Park City in Sedgwick County, Kansas? Defendant: Yes, sir. Court: All right. You had the taxi take you to Park City. What happened then? Defendant: There, I pretended that I was a little drunk. I just took some beer and washed it around my mouth, and the guy could probably smell alcohol on me. I told him to let me out so I could get some fresh air, and I walked from where the taxi let me off over to her house. Court. All right. Where does she live? Defendant. North Independence? Court. All right. When you walked over there, what happened next? Defendant. Well, as before, I was going to have sexual fantasies, so I brought my hit kit, and lo and behold, her car was there. I thought, gee, she's not supposed to be home, so I very carefully snuck into the house. She wasn't there. So about that time the doors rattled, so I went back to one of the bedrooms and hid back there in one of the bedrooms. She came in with a male visitor. They were there for maybe an hour or so. Then he left. I waited till wee hours of the morning. I then proceeded to sneak into her bedroom and flip the lights on real quick-like, or I think the bathroom lights. I didn't want to flip her lights on, and she screamed, and I jumped on the bed and strangled her manually. Court. All right. Now, were you wearing any kind of disguise or mask at this time? Defendant. No. Court. You indicated this woman lived down the street from you. Did she know you? Defendant. Casually. We'd walk by and wave. She liked to work in her yard, as well as I like to work, and it's just a neighborly type thing. It wasn't anything personal, I mean. Just a neighbor. Court. All right. So she was in her bed when you turned on the lights in the bathroom? Defendant. Yeah, the bathroom, yeah. So I could get some light in there. Court. All right. What did you do then? Defendant. Oh, I manually strangled her when she started to scream. Court. So you used your hands? Defendant. Yes, sir. Court. And you strangled her. Did she die? Defendant. Yes. Court. All right. What did you do then? Defendant. After that, since I was in the sexual fantasy, I went ahead and stripped her, and probably went ahead and... I'm not for sure. I tied her up at that point in time, but anyway, she was nude, and I put her on a blanket, went through her purse, some personal items in the house, figured out how I was gonna get her out of there, eventually moved her to the trunk of the car, took the car over to Christ Lutheran Church, this is with the older church, and took some pictures of her. Court. All right, you took some photographs of her. What kind of camera did you use? Defendant. Polaroid? Court. All right. Did you keep those photographs? Defendant. Yes. The police probably have them. Court. All right. What happened then? Defendant. That was it. She went through... I tied, she was already dead, so I took pictures of her in different forms of bondage, and that's probably what got me in trouble, is the bondage thing. So anyway, that's probably the main thing. But anyway, after that I moved her back out to the car, and then we went east on 53rd. Court. All right. What occurred then? Defendant. Sir? Court. What happened then? Defendant. Oh, trying to find a place to hide the body. Court. Did you find a place? Defendant. Yes, I did. Court. Where? Defendant. Couldn't tell you without looking at a map, but it was on 53rd, between Greenwich, maybe, what's the other one between Greenwich and Rock? Mr. Osborne. Webb. Defendant. Webb. Between Webb and Greenwich, I found a ditch, a low place on the north side of the road, and I hid her there. Court. All right. You said you hid her there. Did you, Defendant. Well, there were some trees, some brush, and I laid that over the top of her body. Court. All right. So you removed the body from the car, put her in the ditch, and then laid some brush over the body. Defendant. Yes, sir. The murder of Dolores E. Davis. Court. Now, sir, let's turn to count 10. In that count, it's claimed that on or about the 18th day of January, 1991, to the 19th day of January, 1991, in the county of Sedgwick, state of Kansas, that you did then and there unlawfully kill a human being, that being Dolores E. Davis, maliciously, willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation, by strangulation, inflicting injuries from which the said Dolores E. Davis did die on January 19th, 1991. Mr. Rader, please tell me what you did here in Sedgwick County, Kansas, on that day that makes you believe you're guilty. Defendant: That particular day I had some commitments. I left those, went to one place, changed my clothes, went to another place, parked my car, finally made arrangements on my hit kit, my clothes, and then walked to that residence. After spending some time at that residence, it was very cold that night. Had reservations about going in because I cased the place before, and I really couldn't figure out how to get in, and she was in the house, so I finally just selected a concrete block and threw it through the plate glass window on the east and came on in. Court: All right. Where is this residence located? Defendant: It's on Hillside, but I couldn't give the address. I know it's probably 61, probably 62-something. I don't know, 62-something. Court: North or south? Defendant: North Hillside. Court: All right. So you used a concrete block to break a window? Defendant: Mm-hmm. Plate glass window, patio door, mm-hmm. Court: All right. What happened then? Defendant: Noise. I just went in. She came out of a bedroom and thought a car had hit her house, and I told her that I used the ruse of being wanted. I was on the run. I needed food, car, warmth, warm up, and then I asked her. I handcuffed her and kind of talked to her, told her that I would like to get some food, get her keys to her car, and kind of rest assured, walked, talked with her a little bit, and calmed her down a little bit. But then eventually I checked. I think she was still handcuffed. I went back and checked out where the car was, simulating getting some food, odds and ends in the house, kind of like I was leaving. Then I went back and removed her handcuffs, and then I tied her up, and then eventually strangled her. Court: All right. You say eventually strangled her. Defendant: Well, after I tied her up, I went through some things in the room there and then strangled her. Court: All right. You say you went through... Were you looking for something? Defendant: Mm-hmm. Well, some personal items, yes. I took some personal items from there. Court: Did you take personal items in every one of these incidents? Defendant: I did on Hedge. I don't remember anything in Vicky's place. The Oteros, we got the watch and the radio. I don't think I did any in Bright's. Vian's, no, I don't think so. Fox, yes. I took some things from Fox. It was hit and miss. Court: All right. But in regard... Defendant: Probably if it was a controlled situation where I had more time, I took something. But if it was a confusion and other things I didn't cause, I was trying to get out of there. Court: All right. So in regard to the Davis matter, you went around the room, took a few personal things. What did you do then? Defendant: Strangled her. Court: What did you strangle her with? Defendant: Pantyhose. Court: All right. What happened then? Did she die? Defendant: Kind of like Mrs. Hedge. I already figured out I had a, plan on leaving and put her in a blanket and drug her to the car, put her in the trunk of the car. Court: So you were able to strangle her to death with these pantyhose? Defendant: Yes, sir. Court: All right. You put her in your car. Defendant: In her car. Court: Or in a car. Defendant: Her car. Court: Her car or trunk? Defendant: Uh-huh, the trunk of her car. Uh-huh. Court: What happened then? Defendant: I really had a commitment I needed to go to, so I moved her to one spot, took her out of her car. This gets complicated. Then the stuff I had, clothes, gun, whatever, I took that to another spot in her car, dumped that off. Okay. Then took her car back to her house. Left that. Let me think now. Okay, in the interim, I took her car back to her house. In the interim, I realized that I had lost one of my guns. I dropped it somewhere. So I was distraught, trying to figure out where my gun was. So I went back in the house, realized I had dropped it when I broke the plate glass window. It dropped. It fell on the floor right there, and I found it right there. So that solved that problem. Anyway, I went back out, threw the keys, checked the car real quick-like, and threw the keys up on top of the roof of her house, walked from her car back to my car, took my car, drove it back, and I either dropped more stuff off or I picked her up and put 'em in my car, and then I drove northwest of Sedgwick County and dropped her off underneath a bridge. Court. All right. So all of these incidents, these 10 counts, occurred because you wanted to satisfy a sexual fantasy? Is that correct? Defendant. Yes. Court. Does any party desire any further matters to be put on the record at this time? Mr. Osborne. No, Your Honor. Court. All right. You may be seated, Mr. Rader. Chapter 38. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Excerpts from Ridgway's confession when he pleaded guilty to murdering 48 women in the notorious Green River killings, as read in court by Prosecutor Jeff Baird. I killed the 48 women listed in the state's Second Amended information. In most cases, when I killed these women, I did not know their names. Most of the time I killed them the first time I met them, and I do not have a good memory of their faces. I have reviewed information and discovered about each of the murders with my attorneys, and I am positive that I killed each of the women charged in the second information. I killed most of them in my house near Military Road, and I killed a lot of them in my truck, not far from where I picked them up. I killed some of them outside. I remember leaving each woman's body in the place where she was found. I have discussed with my attorneys the common scheme or plan, aggravating circumstances charged in all of these murders. I agree that each of the murders I committed was part of a common scheme or plan. The plan was I wanted to kill as many women I thought were prostitutes as I possibly could. I picked prostitutes as my victims because I hate most prostitutes and I did not want to pay them for sex. I also picked prostitutes as victims because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught. Another part of my plan was where I put the bodies of these women. Most of the time I took the women's jewelry and their clothes to get rid of any evidence and make them harder to identify. I placed most of the bodies in groups, which I call clusters. I did this because I wanted to keep track of all the women I killed. I like to drive by the clusters around the county and think about the women I placed there. I usually used a landmark to remember a cluster and the women I placed there. Sometimes I killed and dumped a woman intending to start a new cluster and never returned because I thought I might get caught putting more women there. Chapter 39. Edmund Kemper. Kemper made the following statements to the police on the occasion of his picking two young hitchhikers, using a gun and knife to control them, and murdering them both. At this time, I had full intentions of killing both of them. I would have loved to have raped them, but not having any experience at all in this area, with very limited exposure to the opposite sex, I guess the learning point, 15 to 21, I was locked up with all men, for having murdered his grandparents. And there wasn't any opportunity to be with women or girls, and this was one of the big problems I had, and one of the biggest things that caused me to be so uptight. So, even trying to communicate with girls before this happened, just casually, I felt like a big bumblebutt, and I think it's just like an overage teenager trying to fit in. They were both 18 at the time, I think, and I was 23, which isn't that much of a gap, but it was just like a million years. Anyway, I decided that Anita was more gullible and would be easier to control, so I told her that she was going to go into the trunk. And she stepped right out of the car, and I had a pair of handcuffs I had purchased. I took the cuffs out and reached for one of Mary Ann's arms, and she grabbed it back. I picked up the gun like I was going to hit her with it and told her not to do that again. I said, I'm running the show here, or some such cliché. So she allowed me to put my handcuffs on her arm, and I put the other one around the seatbelt, behind the lock, so it wouldn't come up, and left her back there. I took the other girl to the trunk. Just before she got in, she reiterated something Mary Ann said. "Please don't do this," or something like that. I said, "What, are you going to start in too?" Back in the car, Kemper found that Mary Ann was trying to get free. I almost stuck the gun up her nose to impress her that that was a real gun, and that she kept getting me more uptight than I was. And then her lips started quivering, rather than her friends, and I started losing control, and I told her that if she kept this up, that they were all going to be in a whole lot of trouble. At this point, she cooperated. I handcuffed her behind her back and turned her over and tried to put a plastic bag over her head. I had this nifty idea about suffocating her. I was going to be really smart, and the windows were rolled up, and just normal conversation wouldn't carry. It was a fairly populated area. It was up on the hill. You couldn't hear voices or anything way off in the distance, so I didn't want anything carrying that would be conspicuous. She was complaining that she couldn't breathe. I said I'd tear a hole in the bag, not intending to really, and I had a terry cloth bathrobe with a long rope tie. I put a loop in it and started pulling it down over what I thought was her neck. I pulled it tight. That's about where I blew it. What he meant was that he broke the rope, which had caught in her mouth, and she bit a hole in the plastic bag. Kemper, infuriated, pulled a blade. I poised the blade over her back, trying to decide where her heart was, and struck and hit her in the middle of the back, and it stuck a little bit, and she said something like, "Ow," or "Oh," and I did it again, and did the same damn thing, and I was getting mad now, and I told her to shut up after the second time, and she said, "I can't," and was moaning. She was struggling, but she couldn't move too much. Then I started thrusting hard, and I was hitting, but apparently I wasn't hitting, or the blade wasn't long enough, which it wasn't conceivable to me because she wasn't that large a girl, rather small in fact, about 5'2", and maybe 105 pounds. I struck in several places on both sides of the back, and noticed as I went further down the back that she was a little louder and more painful in her cries, but none got really loud. That always bothered me. I couldn't figure out why. It was almost like she didn't want to blow up and start screaming or something. She was maintaining control. But when I started doing this, then it got to be too much for her. She twisted around, and I hit her once in the side with the knife. She turned completely over to see what the hell I was doing, I guess, or to get her back away from me, and I stabbed her once in the stomach and the lower intestine. It didn't have any effect. There wasn't any blood or anything. There was absolutely no contact with improper areas. In fact, I think once I accidentally, this bothers me too, personally, I brushed, I think with the back of my hand when I was handcuffing her, against one of her breasts, and it embarrassed me. I even said, "Whoops, I'm sorry," or something like that. She was pretty cognizant of what was going on, and it was getting pretty messy there in the back seat. She turned back over on her stomach, and I continued stabbing. I don't know how many times I stabbed her. I'm trying to think. I usually check something like that. You might say almost comparing notes, and in this case I didn't. I did with Anita, 'cause that really amazed me. With Mary Ann, I was really quite struck by her personality and her looks, and there was just almost a reverence there. I didn't even touch her, really too much after that. That is, other than to get rid of physical evidence, such as clothing, and later the body. Anyway, she was across the back of the seat, and her head down towards the door, towards the space between the front seat and back seat, and I don't think the bag was on. She had shaken it off. She was crying out a little louder, and I kept trying to shut her up, covering her mouth up, and she kept pulling away, and one time she didn't, and it was like a cry, and I could have sworn it came out her back. There were several holes in the lung area, and bubbles and things coming out, and the sounds shook me up, and I backed off at that point. She turned her head to look at the back of the seat, and she called her friend's name, her first name. It was slow, and it was not loud. That was the last thing that she said. She wasn't passing out at that point. I don't think at that point that the full impact of what had happened had really hit her. I think she was pretty well in shock, or something. I felt I was getting nowhere, not that I wasn't getting any kicks out of stabbing her, but hoped that one would do it. When it got quite messy like that, I reached around and grabbed her by the chin and pulled her head back and slashed her throat. I made a very definite effort at it, and it was extremely deep on both sides. She lost consciousness immediately, and there was no more vocal sounds anyway. At that point, Kemper got up in a daze and headed to the back of the car. I knew I had to do it to the other girl right then, because she had heard all the struggle, and she must have known something very serious was going on. Part 5. Test Your Serial Killer IQ. Following are several questions and quizzes to test your knowledge of serial killers. Some of the questions are based on information in the text, but a few are not. We think true ghouls will know the answers. Q&A. Question: what happened at these locations? 3123 Center Street, Salem, Oregon. 47th and Hawthorne, Portland, Oregon. Parking garage, Mayer and Frank's department store, Salem, Oregon. Rest area on road leading to Sanchin Pass, just north of Albany, Oregon, and slightly east of Interstate 5. Answer: Oregon killer Jerry Brudos killed young women. Question: what happened at these locations? Bridge across New York State Thruway, near 170 Dreiser Loop, Bronx, New York. 2860 Boer Avenue, Bronx, New York. 33rd Avenue, 159th Street, Queens, New York. 8331 262nd Street, Queens, New York. Station Plaza, Continental Avenue, Queens, New York. Dartmouth Avenue, 3 blocks from 69th Avenue, opposite Forest Hills Gardens, Queens, New York. 1 block from 1950 Hutchinson River, Bronx, New York. Shore Road, near Bay 17th Street Park, Queens, New York. Answer: the son of Sam shot people. Match game. Match the killers with their nicknames. 1. Albert Fish. 2. Dean Coral. 3. Bobby Joe Long. 4. Randall Woodfield. 5. John Wayne Gacy. 6. Gary Ridgway. 7. Juan Corona. 8. Albert DeSalvo. 9. Harvey Glattman. 10. William Hirons. A. Boston Strangler. B. I-5 Killer. C. Lonely Hearts Killer. D. Candyman. E. Machete Murderer. F. Lipstick Killer. G. Ad Rapist. H. Killer Clown. I. Gray Man. J. Green River Killer. Match game. Match the killers with their nicknames. 1. Richard Ramirez. 2. Jerry Brudos. 3. Richard Trenton Chase. 4. Arthur Shawcross. 5. Ed Gein. 6. Edmund Kemper. 7. Dennis Rader. 8. William Bonin. 9. Kenneth Bianchi. 10. David Berkowitz. A. Shoe Fetish Slayer. B. Hillside Strangler. C. Freeway Killer. D. BTK Killer. E. Son of Sam. F. Night Stalker. G. Genesee River Killer. H. Vampire of Sacramento. I. Plainfield Butcher. J. Co-ed Killer. Match game. Match the killers with their birthplaces. 1. Richard Ramirez. 2. Kenneth Bianchi. 3. Dennis Rader. 4. David Berkowitz. 5. Edmund Kemper. 6. Jerry Brudos. 7. Albert DeSalvo. 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. 9. Herbert Mullen. 10. Arthur Shawcross. A. Burbank, California. B. Brooklyn, New York. C. Webster, South Dakota. D. Kittery, Maine. E. Wichita, Kansas. F. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. G. Santa Cruz, California. H. El Paso, Texas. I. Rochester, New York. J. Chelsea, Massachusetts. Match game. Match the foreign killers with their nicknames. 1. Peter Sutcliffe. 2. Nikolai Tsumagaliev. 3. Pedro Lopez. 4. Lucien Staniak. 5. Thierry Polan. 6. Andre Chikatilo. 7. Peter Curtin. 8. John Wayne Glover. 9. Clifford Olson. 10. Harold Shipman. A. Metal Fang. B. Vampire of Dusseldorf. C. Monster of Montmartre. D. Beast of British Columbia. E. Dr. Death. F. Yorkshire Ripper. G. Red Spider. H. Monster of the Andes. I. Granny Killer. J. Rostov Ripper. Q&A. Question: what happened at these locations? 2900 East Chevy Chase Drive, Glendale, California. 6510 Forest Lawn Drive, Glendale, California. 2833 Alta Terrace, La Crescenta, California. 4100 block of Ramos Way, Highland Park, California. 1500 block of Londa Street, Elysian Park, California. Los Feliz off-ramp from southbound Golden Gate Freeway, California. 1217 Cliff Drive, Glassell, California. 2006 North Alvarado, Echo Lake, California. Angeles Crest Highway, California. 703 Colorado Drive, Glendale, California. Answer: the Hillside Strangler, Buono and Bianchi, dumped their murder victims. Who am I? 1. As a child, I was bright and well-adjusted. I was an altar boy and a good student. I was brought up in John Steinbeck country, Salinas, California. 2. Just after graduating from high school, my best friend was killed in an automobile accident. I was emotionally devastated, and this event may have triggered the mental deterioration that was to come. 3. By my early 20s, schizophrenia had begun to manifest itself. Further aggravating my mental condition with the use of LSD and other drugs, I became a walking time bomb. 4. My increasingly bizarre behavior included echopraxia, mimicking another person's exact movements, burning my penis with a cigarette, and responding out loud to telepathic messages I was receiving. 5. I had been in and out of mental institutions, but on that final release, I began my carnage. After the fact, California Governor Ronald Reagan called my release a psychiatric mistake. 6. Among my 13 victims was a homeless man I beat to death with a baseball bat, a Catholic priest I stabbed to death in a confessional, and a young mother and her 2 children whom I shot. 7. Not only did I hear voices in my head commanding me to kill, I also heard the voices of my victims telling me they were ready to be sacrificed. 8. In my psychotic state, I believed that in committing these murders, I was preventing a cataclysmic earthquake and tidal wave from destroying California. 9. After my arrest, and in jail awaiting my trial, I was in adjoining cells with another California serial murderer, Ed Kemper. A mutual dislike kept us taunting each other the whole time. 10. Although my attorneys presented a defense of not guilty by reason of insanity, the jury found me guilty of both first and second-degree murder, and I was sentenced to life imprisonment. I will be eligible for parole in 2025. Answer: I am Herbert Mullen. Match game. Match the serial killers with the correctional facility. 1. David Berkowitz. 2. Edmund Kemper. 3. Richard Ramirez. 4. Wayne Williams. 5. Dennis Rader. 6. Robert Hansen. 7. Herbert Mullen. 8. Arthur Shawcross. 9. Gary Ridgway. 10. Juan Corona. A. Washington State Penitentiary, Walla Walla, Washington. B. El Dorado Correctional Facility, El Dorado, Kansas. C. Mule Creek State Prison, Lone, California. D. Sullivan Correctional Facility, Fallsburg, New York. E. San Quentin State Prison, San Quentin, California. F. California Medical Facility, Vacaville, California. G. Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Center, Middleton, New York. H. Spring Creek Correctional Center, Seward, Alaska. I. Corcoran State Prison, Corcoran, California. J. Hancock State Prison, Sparta, Georgia. Match game. Name that serial killer. 1. He had intercourse with his wife 6 times a day. 2. His biological father may well have been his grandfather. 3. His mother disciplined him when he was a child by placing his hand on a hot stove. 4. He cooked and ate a 10-year-old girl over a 9-day period. 5. He ground up his mother's voice box in a garbage disposal. 6. He had a partner in serial murder. 7. His mother dressed him as a girl when he went to school. 8. He probably killed John Walsh's son, Adam. 9. He turned back from a planned murder spree on Long Island because of a thunderstorm. Q&A. Question. Are there any physical differences between serial murderers and ordinary people? Answer. Not at all. The only differences are in their heads and hearts, and that is quite profound. Question. What happened at these locations? 1940 Commonwealth Avenue, Boston. 73 Newell Street, Lynn, Massachusetts, Apartment 9. 7 Grove Street, Boston. 435 Columbia Road, Boston. 315 Huntington Avenue, Boston, Apartment 4C. 515 Park Drive, Boston. 319 Park Avenue, Salem, Massachusetts. 4 University Road, Cambridge, Massachusetts. 224 Lafayette Street, Salem, Massachusetts. Answer. The Boston Strangler killed people. Question. What percentage of serial murder victims are female? 1. 40%. 2. 65%. 3. 75%. 4. 87%. Answer. 2. 65%. Question. What percentage of serial killers are heterosexual? 1. 50%. 2. 62%. 3. 75%. 4. 86%. Answer. 4. 86%. Who am I? 1. As a child, I exhibited the 3 indicators of a possible future serial killer: bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals. 2. In all likelihood, I was born with a congenital mental illness, but this condition was greatly exacerbated by my constant drug abuse. 3. I developed rabid hypochondria. My delusions included thinking that my heart stopped beating on occasion, that my stomach was in backward, and that there were bones growing out of the back of my head. 4. As my psychotic behavior worsened, I began to think my heart was shrinking. I felt this could only be remedied by drinking blood. I began killing and disemboweling rabbits. I would eat the intestines raw and drink the blood. 5. I was institutionalized as a paranoid schizophrenic, but eventually released. Back on the street, my craving for blood continued. I began stealing neighborhood pets. Cats and dogs became the new objects of my bloodlust. 6. In time, I graduated to human prey, killing people to get their blood. 2 of my victims were women whom I savagely mutilated, pulling out their intestines and drinking their blood. 7. With 6 victims in my wake, the FBI was brought in to do a profile. I would turn out to be a classic, disorganized killer, with little planning of the murders and even less regard for covering my tracks. The details of the profiling would prove uncannily accurate and would lead to my arrest. 8. A search of my apartment was like something out of a nightmare. A blender and glasses stained with blood, body parts, pieces of bone, and brain tissue in jars and on plates in the refrigerator. Everything reeked of rot and decomposition. 9. The defense had asked for second-degree murder charges to reflect my obvious insanity, but the jury felt I knew right from wrong and found me guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. I was sentenced to be executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. 10. While on death row, I committed suicide in my prison cell by overdosing on antidepressant pills I had secretly saved up for weeks. Answer: I am Richard Chase. Q&A. Question: Who was the first person executed by means of lethal injection in the state of California? Answer: Serial killer William Bonin. Who am I? 1. I was born in Maine in 1945, but my family moved to Watertown, New York, near the Canadian border, when I was very young. 2. The real truth about my childhood is uncertain, but I spoke of a turbulent family life and of being sexually abused by an aunt at the age of 9. I had sex with my younger sister and had my first homosexual encounter at age 11. 3. In 1967, I joined the Army and served a 1-year tour of duty in Vietnam. I related horrendous stories of murder and mutilation in the jungles and villages. I would claim a combat kill of 39 enemies, but Army records showed that the unit in which I served in saw little, if any, combat. 4. Once out of the service, I became a serial arsonist and was eventually arrested for trying to break into a service station. I would serve 2 years of a 5-year sentence for this offense. 5. In May 1972, the killing began. My first victim was a 10-year-old boy whom I lured into the woods on the promise of going fishing. My second victim was an 8-year-old girl whom I lured to a deserted area while showing her a new bicycle. Both children were strangled, and the girl had been sexually assaulted. 6. Eyewitnesses had seen me with the children, and I was arrested. I confessed to both murders, but in a plea bargain deal, I was charged with only 1 case of manslaughter. I would serve 14.5 years of a 25-year sentence. I was released early because I was a model prisoner, and the authorities thought I had been reformed and could safely return to society as a productive citizen. 7. Upon my parole, I found it difficult to find a permanent residence. When newspapers or townspeople found out about my past, there would be an uproar, and I would have to move on. In an effort to settle me somewhere, the parole board made the monumentally bad decision to cover my trail and seal my records from any further investigation. This allowed me to finally settle in Rochester, New York, an upstate community situated on the Genesee River. 8. About a year after I got out of prison, the bodies of murdered prostitutes began showing up, usually dumped in the Genesee Gorge area. The women had all been asphyxiated, and sometimes mutilated. As the body count kept rising, and the same MO was seen over and over, Rochester police realized they were dealing with a serial killer. An intense manhunt began. 9. One winter day, the police got an incredibly lucky break. A helicopter pilot spotted a body splayed out on the ice below a bridge on the river. I was seen urinating outside my car, which was still parked on the bridge. I was followed and questioned. Subsequent interrogations and mounting evidence finally convinced me to admit to the 10 murders. 10. My lawyers tried a defense of post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from my Vietnam experiences, as well as an insanity defense. The jury didn't buy it. I'll be a free man in 250 years. Answer: I am Arthur Shawcross. Who am I? 1. I was born in Glasgow, Scotland, the illegitimate child of a young waitress. My girlfriend was born in a suburb of Manchester, England. We met while working together at a chemical plant in the early 1960s. 2. Two of my heroes were Adolf Hitler and the Marquis de Sade. In my library, I had books on pornography, sexual sadism, torture, and murder. I had intense fantasies relating to bondage and domination. My girlfriend worshipped me and my beliefs and would become a willing participant in our crimes. 3. Our victims were all children, 3 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from 10 to 17. We would lure them into our car using various ploys and drive them out to the moors or to our house, where we sexually assaulted and murdered them. We then buried the bodies in shallow graves on the moors. 4. We were turned in by my girlfriend's 18-year-old brother-in-law, who was horrified after witnessing the gory murder of my last victim, a young man whom I bludgeoned with the blunt end of a hatchet while I strangled him to death. 5. During the trial, the courtroom sat in stunned silence as they listened to a 16-minute tape recording we made of a 10-year-old female victim screaming and pleading for her life before she was raped and murdered. 6. Because we were considered the most hated couple in Britain, and police were fearful of a courtroom assassination, we had to sit in a 3-sided enclosure surrounded by 4-inch-thick, bulletproof glass. 7. We were both sentenced to life in prison. I have now been behind bars for more than 40 years. In 1985, I was transferred to a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. 8. I have made several efforts to starve myself by going on hunger strikes while in prison. While I believe I have the right to take my own life, the courts will not allow it. I am now kept alive through force-feeding. I have written my autobiography, which I wish to have published upon my death. 9. Although many people campaigned for the release of my former girlfriend, stating that she was a changed person, she was never released. In 2002, she died of a heart attack at age 60 after serving 37 years. 10. Many in Britain still regard this horrific case as the trial of the century. Answer: I am Ian Brady. My girlfriend was Myra Hindley. Who am I? 1. I was born to a mixed-race couple on the Caribbean island of Martinique. 2 days after I was born, my father abandoned me and my 17-year-old unwed mother. 2. At 18 months of age, I was sent to live with my paternal grandmother. At age 10, I was returned to my mother and eventually wound up living with my biological father, who was then in Paris. 3. I threatened my teacher with a kitchen knife when I was 12 years old. Although I was something of a social outcast and a homosexual, I joined the military at age 17. 4. Upon leaving the Army, I began working in a transsexual nightclub. I was drawn to the glitz and glamour of the gay nightlife, and I dreamed of someday owning my own club. It was at this time that I met a transvestite drug addict, and we became lovers. 5. My lover and I began targeting elderly women for petty cash. We would rob and kill them, but it was the brutality of the attacks that was shocking. The women would be suffocated, strangled, or beaten to death. Our sadistic behavior included forcing one woman to drink drain cleaner when she wouldn't reveal where she hid her money. 6. As the number of victims mounted, fear gripped Paris, and there were demonstrations in the street demanding that the police protect the elderly. The huge police presence and increased security prompted us to flee Paris and move to the town of Toulouse, hundreds of miles away. The killings stopped, temporarily. 7. We spent the money we made from selling drugs and stealing credit cards lavishly on ostentatious parties and a wild nightlife. Our relationship eventually ended, and I returned to Paris about a year later, only to resume my killing ways, but this time on my own. 8. One of my last victims, although left for dead, recovered unexpectedly and was able to give the police an accurate description of her attacker. I was apprehended while walking down the street and questioned for 43 hours without a break. I confessed to more than 20 murders of elderly women ranging in age from 71 to 91. 9. I was incarcerated and immediately put in isolation. There was fear that I would be set upon by the other prisoners. 10. The case would never come to trial. I died in prison from complications related to AIDS. I was 25 years old. Answer: I am Thierry Paulin. This concludes The Killer Book of Serial Killers by Tom Philbin and Michael Philbin. Narrated by Jason Keller. Copyright 2009 by Tom Philbin and Michael Philbin. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Sourcebooks, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2022 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit Tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.